The dungeon door isn't locked. That's the part that should frighten you. 30 steps down into air that isn't cold, only old. Old the way something sealed too long is old. Something that stopped waiting for anyone to open a window. A man hangs against the far wall, arms spread wide by iron rings driven into stone. His head is bowed. Dark hair matted with sweat and something darker than sweat. In the corner, a torch gutters and refuses to die, as though even the fire down here has decided that dying properly isn't worth the trouble. There's a smell in that iron. Resinous. Something that doesn't grow anywhere within 100 miles of these walls. And in the dust of the passage above, there are footprints. Small, careful, fresh. They don't belong to the girl coming down the stairs. 3 hours until dawn. Upstairs, men have already agreed that by morning this will be finished. Her palm flattens against the wood. Cold enough to hurt, she pushes. The night the king was left to die, Wren counted the stairs. Not because she needed to count them. She had walked this staircase 100 times before, carrying broth for sick servants, herbs for the old cook's swollen knees, bandages for the stable hands who never learned to keep their fingers away from horse teeth. She knew every crack in the stone. She knew where the moss grew thick enough to make a foot slip in the wet season. She knew without looking exactly how many steps separated the world above from the world below. But counting kept her hands from shaking. 12 steps. Then a landing. Then 18 more, and the air changed. Not colder, exactly, older. Like breathing something that had been sealed too long. Something that had given up waiting for anyone to open a window. She adjusted the clay pot against her hip and kept walking. Her name was Wren. She was 23 years old. She had no rank, no family name worth speaking. No reason anyone should have let her pass through the upper gate that night. With nothing but a jar of salve and a stubborn aching conviction that someone in this castle was about to let a man die quietly, and that quiet deaths were the ones nobody ever had to answer for. She had learned that lesson early. Learned it the way Omegas learn most things, sideways. In whispers, in the space between what people said and what they actually meant. A castle teaches a girl like her to listen for the second meaning under every sentence long before it teaches her to speak one of her own. Which was why, when old Torin stopped her at the iron gate that separated the servants' halls from the lower dungeon, she had already rehearsed her face into something small and harmless. A face that asked for nothing. A face that expected to be turned away and had already made its peace with it. He looked at the clay pot. Then at her. You shouldn't be down here tonight, girl, I know. You especially, I know that too. He was quiet for a long moment. Torin had a face like driftwood, weathered by 40 years of standing in doorways that other men used to walk through unbothered, never once glancing his way, the way people never look twice at furniture that has always been there. His eyes were the kind that had seen every lie a servant could tell, and had stopped being fooled by most of them decades ago. He had watched 3 kings come and go through this castle and buried more friends than most men make in a lifetime, and none of that had ever once made him careless. Except this time something in his expression didn't sharpen. It softened. Just enough. Don't stay long, he said. That was all. No explanation. No warning about what waited below. Just 4 words and gates creaking open. On a hinge that hadn't been oiled in longer than Wren had been alive. She took it as permission. Because in her whole life small permissions were the only kind anyone had ever handed her. Large ones were never offered. You had to steal those quietly, in the dark, and hope no one noticed until it was already too late to take them back. She stepped through. The corridor swallowed the torchlight almost immediately. What little remained pooled in uneven patches, gold turning to rust, turning to nothing, and between those patches the dark pulled at her like something with weight, like water she had to wade through instead of simply walk. Her own breathing sounded too loud in it. Her own footsteps sounded like a kantikan, counted doors instead of steps now. 1, 2, 3. The 4th had light beneath it, not warm light, sick light. The kind a torch throws when it's been left burning too long without anyone bothering to change it, gasping and guttering and refusing, out of pure stubbornness, to actually go out. As though even the fire down here had decided the effort of dying properly wasn't worth the trouble. She pressed her palm flat against the door. The wood was cold enough to hurt. Turn back, said the sensible part of her mind. The part Zelda had spent 6 years trying to cultivate. Turn back now, this is not your fight. This is not your risk to take. You have survived 23 years by staying small and staying quiet and staying exactly where people expect you to be. That is the whole of your survival, built one careful year at a time, and you are about to spend it in a single night on a man you have never spoken to. Except she was already here. Except the door wasn't locked, and that told her something worse than any lock could have. A lock means a man is still worth guarding. An open door means the men above have already decided he's finished, that whatever remains behind it can be safely ignored until morning, that no one worth the trouble of a lock would ever bother coming down to check. So she pushed it open. He was chained to the far wall, not sitting, not slumped, held upright, arms spread wide by iron rings driven straight into the stone in a posture some cruel architect had clearly designed to look like a display, like a warning. Like proof hung on a wall for anyone who cared to look, that even kings could be made small enough to fit inside 4 feet of damp stone. His head was bowed. Dark hair fell forward matted with sweat and something darker. For one long with lurchings, Ren thought she'd come too late. Then his chest rose slow. Costly. But it rose, Cecile in 6 steps and dropped to her knees beside him, setting the clay pot down with hands that were, despite everything, steadier than she expected. Steadier than she had any right to expect, given that her heart was trying to climb directly out of her throat. Look at it first as a healer, his voice said. Somewhere in the back of her mind, worn smooth from years of repetition. Feel it after, never the other way. The moment you feel it first, you stop being useful. So she looked. Lacerations across both forearms, deep enough that the iron had clearly bitten through more than once. Edges of the wounds gone an angry, infected red that told her they'd been left untreated far longer than any wound should be. A bruise along his jaw gone the color of rotted plums. His armor stripped away, leaving only rough linen torn at the shoulder, and beneath it skin that told its own story without needing words at all. He was larger than she'd expected. She had seen him once before, from across the great hall, distant and untouchable on a dais where the air itself seemed to bend around him, the way a room bends around anything large enough to matter. Up close, chained and broken, he was still somehow enormous, which made the chains feel less like a punishment and more like an insult, a small petty cruelty layered over a large one. She reached for his nearest wrist. His head snapped up and his eyes found hers gray, pale storm-colored gray, the exact shade of sky in the second before it decides whether to break. They fixed on her with an intensity that pinned her in place harder than any chain ever could, and for one absurd moment, she thought, this is a man who has never once in his life had to work to hold anyone's attention. Who? Not a question. A demand dragged up from somewhere rough and unused. A voice that sounded like it had spent days shouting into stone and getting nothing back. Ren, she said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. I helped the healer Iselda's apprentice. She's unwell. She sent what she could. Half a lie. Iselda hadn't sent her anywhere. Iselda didn't know she was here at all. Was at this very moment almost certainly asleep in her own bed. Entirely unaware that her apprentice had stolen a clay pot of salve and walked into a dungeon on a rumor and a hunch and a stubborn refusal to let a man die because no one else would bother stopping it. But Iselda had also taught her that a partial truth, offered kindly, does more good than a whole truth offered badly. So Ren let the lie sit between them and said nothing more to defend it. He watched her a long moment. Something shifted behind those gray eyes. Not warmth. Nothing so simple, more like recalculation. A man revising an assessment he'd already made and filed away, discovering the file was wrong. You shouldn't be here, I know. She reached for his wrist again. This time he didn't pull away, which given that he could have given that even now, weakened and starved, a man his size might have snapped the chain clean, if there'd been enough strength left in him. Felt significant. Felt like a choice made deliberately, by a man who had very few choices left to make. She worked in silence, applied the salve. Watched the torchlight throw their shadows against the wall, hers small and hunched, his enormous even chained and broken, 2 shapes that had no business sharing a room and were sharing one anyway. After a while, without lifting his head fully, he said, they'll come back in the morning. I know, they mean to finish it quietly, blame the chains. She moved to the second wrist instead, and made herself breathe evenly while she worked because her hands had started to shake again and this was not the moment. How many on the council? She asked, a pause. Surprise maybe, that she'd asked something strategic instead of something frightened, the way a healer's apprentice was supposed to ask. 4, 5 a beat. Lord Draven is the architect. Draven. Ren knew that name the way everyone in the castle knew it. The way you know the name of a cold wind before it arrives. Because the animals go quiet first. Because something in the air changes before the thing itself ever shows its face. There's a passage, she said, keeping her voice level, behind the east cistern. Servants use it in winter when the main hall's ice over. It comes out near the outer wall, by the stables. She looked up. Met his eyes directly this time, instead of glancing away the way 23 years of careful survival had trained her to do. If the chains weren't a problem. If someone brought a key. His eyes didn't widen, but something in them sharpened, like a blade drawn 1 inch from its sheath. You, he said slowly, are not what I expected. No one expects much from an Omega. She said it without bitterness, mostly without it. That's occasionally useful. The quiet that followed had weight to it, possibility. The particular hush that settles between two people who have just, without quite meaning to, made a decision together, the kind of quiet that cannot be unmade once it has finished forming. She closed the clay pot and stood, wrapping her cloak tighter. I'll come back before dawn. She'd almost reached the door when his voice caught her. She stopped. Why? She considered a dozen answers, discarded them. Everyone felt either too small or too large for the moment, too clever or too plain, too much like something a person says when they want credit for the thing they're about to do. She settled on the truth. Because no one should be left to disappear quietly. A pause, not even a king. She didn't wait to see his face. She slipped back into the corridor, and the dark swallowed her. And somewhere above her heart was hammering so hard it felt like something trying to escape her chest before she'd finished deciding whether to let it. 3 hours until dawn. And she had never in her entire careful invisible life done a single thing that could not be undone. The key was the first problem. She had spoken with a confidence in that cell she did not fully possess. Now, climbing back through the dark passages, with her heart still hammering, she pulled the plan apart thread by thread and found most of it made of nothing at all. A door. A passage. A story she had told a man in chains as though it were already arranged, when in truth she had not arranged a single piece of it. A key. A passage. A man could barely draw a full breath. Think, she told herself. Not fast. Clear. Because panic is a luxury. Because when you are the lowest rank in a hierarchy as old as these stones, panic is the thing that kills you faster than any enemy ever could. Iselda taught you that over and over in every crisis of every winter for 6 years. So use it now when it actually mattered. The dungeon keys hung on an iron ring at the guard post beside the torch bracket. 3 of them, heavy old. She'd seen them there 100 times without ever once thinking she might need them. The way you see the same door in your own house for years, without ever wondering what's behind it. Torin held them during his watch. Torin, who'd been a servant in castle for 40 years. Torin, who Ren knew from long evenings in the servants' hall, sharing bread and complaints about aching backs and children long since grown and gone, had no love at all for Lord Draven, or the faction quietly reshaping the council since midsummer. She didn't think he'd hand her the keys outright. That would be asking an old man to burn down 40 years of careful survival in a single gesture. But she thought he might set them down. If she gave him a reason to look somewhere else, she found him exactly where she'd left him. Square shoulders, gray hair, a face like weatherbark, a cup of something warm steaming in his hands, the small private comfort of a man near the end of a long cold shift. He watched her over the rim of the cup, said nothing. He's alive, she said quietly. For now. Torin set the cup down. There's a sound, she continued, keeping her voice even, from the third door in the lower passage. Scratching. Could be rats. A pause. Could be something in the wall. You should check it before your report. Silence. The candle flame bent sideways, though there was no wind in the room to explain it. Then Torin stood, picked up his torch, walked toward the lower passage without a word, without looking at the key ring, without looking at her at all. He'd a gap of perhaps 4 feet between himself and the hook on the wall. She did not waste it. And this, she thought, moving fast, moving quiet. This is the part where you find out whether 40 years of loyalty to a dead king's memory is worth more to an old man than his own safety. Which it apparently was, because he never once looked back. The east cistern chamber was 3 levels up and across the width of the castle's inner ward. Ren moved through it carrying not just the keys but the clay pot, her cloak, and a second bundle collected on the way from Iselda's store's clean linen for binding, a vial of stronger willow bark tincture, hard bread and dried meat wrapped in cloth. Whatever came next, the man in that cell hadn't been fed properly, and a man cannot walk far on an empty body. Whatever a king's pride might insist otherwise. That she also took one of Iselda's spare cloaks, plain, undyed wool, servant's dress. The kind of thing that makes a person invisible, the kind of garment that has never once made anyone turn their head twice. By the time she descended again into the deep corridor, the castle above had begun its first slow stirrings. Distant clatter of kitchen fires being stoked. Faint boots on flagstone somewhere far overhead. A rooster, somewhere beyond the walls, deciding it was close enough to morning to start complaining about it. Time was contracting. He heard her before she reached the door. She knew this because when she pushed it open, his head was already lifted, eyes finding hers in the doorway without searching, as though some part of him had simply known the exact second she would arrive. She held up the key ring, something moved through his expression. Not quite relief, not quite surprise. Something caught between the two, complicated and carefully controlled the look of a man who has learned not to show what hope costs him. Because hope, in a place like this, is the most expensive thing a man can afford to feel. Can you stand? Yes, said with absolute certainty. She wasn't sure she believed him. But this wasn't the moment to argue. The lock on the left chain was stiff. She had to work it with both hands, feeling the mechanism grind reluctantly before it finally gave. When the chain released his arm, he brought it forward slowly. Not dramatically. Not with any visible show of pain, though the rigid set of his jaw told her exactly what it cost him. He was a man who wore control like armor, layered over whatever lay beneath. The second chain came easier. When both arms were free, he stood unsupported for the first time. And she stepped closer without quite deciding not to catch him, exactly, but to be within reach. If he fell, he didn't fall, he was steady. Barely, at the very edge of steady. But steady. She held out the plain cloak. He looked at it, then at her. Servant's dress, he said. The most powerful disguise in any castle. A beat. Nooks das with Sir further comment, he took the cloak and pulled it around his shoulders. The effect was imperfect. He was simply too large, too present, too much presence to fully disappear into rough wool. But in bad light, with his dark hair tucked under the hood, it might barely be enough to make a guard's eyes slide past without stopping. She handed him the food. He ate it in 3 efficient bites, the way soldiers eat when they've learned not to be precious about meals. When a meal is simply fuel and sentiment is a luxury for other men. The passage narrows about halfway through, she said, turning toward the door. You'll have to move sideways. There are 2 places where the ceiling drops. After that it opens into the cistern chamber, and from there a door to the outer ward. A pause. The stables are on the left. There's a boy asleep in the loft. Finn. He sleeps heavily. He won't hear us if we're quiet. Us. Cale said. She glanced back. He was watching her with that gray-eyed steadiness she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at everything. Direct, without decoration, as though decoration were a luxury he'd stopped affording himself years ago. I know the passage, she said. You don't. You understand what happens if we're seen. I understand what happens to you if you stay. She held his gaze. I'll take my chances on the other side of that. He held her eyes a moment longer than felt comfortable, and she had the unsteady sensation of being measured against some internal standard she couldn't see, didn't know the shape of. Then he gave one slow nod. Not dismissal. Something closer to acknowledgement. They moved. The cistern chamber was not empty when they reached it. Wren felt it before she understood it. A wrongness in the air, faint but unmistakable, the smell of a torch recently extinguished, still bleeding smoke into the stone. She stopped so suddenly Cale nearly walked into her back. What? He breathed. Not a question so much as an instruction to explain, and fast. She crouched, ran her fingers along the baked dirt floor near the passage mouth. Footprints. Fresh ones. Not hers, not Cale's, not the boots of any guard she recognized by tread. Small, careful steps in the same direction they were about to move. Someone had already been through here tonight. Which meant, she thought, mind scrambling, someone else already knew this route existed. Which meant someone had already cleared it. Which meant except who? Except why? Except was that a mercy or a trap? And how was she supposed to know the difference in the dark on her knees, with a king's life balanced on the decision she made in the next 4 seconds? Wren. His voice low, steady, cutting through the spiral before it could close over her completely. She looked up. Someone's already been through, she said, recently. Friend or enemy? A long beat. Then we move anyway, Cale said. Because staying here is worse than any unknown ahead of us. She hated that he was right. She hated it and stood anyway, and led him forward into the dark with her heart beating a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear of guards anymore, and everything to do with the sudden dizzying knowledge that this plan, her plan, the one she'd built in 3 frantic hours, was no longer entirely hers. Someone else had a hand in it. She just didn't know whose. The passage was exactly as she remembered. Close and cold, smelling of earth and old stone. The ceiling pressing lower in 2 places until Cale had to bend nearly double to clear it without sound. He made no complaint. He moved with a quietness that surprised her given his size, placing each foot with deliberate care, following the pressure of her hand when she reached back to signal a turn or a drop. There was one moment midway through when she stopped because she heard voices, distant above them, carried strangely through the stone. They stood motionless in the dark for what felt like a very long time. She could hear his breathing just behind her, slow, controlled. She was acutely aware of how small the passage was, how close they stood, how the little candle flame she carried threw everything into sharp relief and then snatched it back again. Don't move, she thought. Don't breathe too loud. Don't think about how close he is. That's not useful right now. That is the least useful thought your mind has ever produced, so stop. The voices moved away. They moved forward. The chamber opened around them like a held breath finally released, and beyond its heavy door the pre-dawn gray of the outer ward spread cold and quiet and open. The stable was exactly where she'd said. Finn was exactly where she'd said, curled in the loft, mouth open, entirely oblivious. 3 horses stood in the stalls. Kale went to the largest without hesitation. A dark roan that tossed its head once, then went still when he laid a hand against its neck and murmured something too low for her to catch. She began to saddle it, hands steadier than they had any right to be. They let it out through the side gate, the one the stable hands used for early morning watering, never guarded because why would it be? And then they were outside the walls, on a frost-pale road running north toward the tree line, and the sky was beginning to slighten along its lowest edge. Kale stopped, turned to look back at the castle behind them. At the towers, the walls, the banner still flying above the gate as though nothing had changed. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his stillness that felt immense, like a man taking the full measure of a wound before deciding what it means, taking his time about it, because some wounds do not survive being looked at quickly. Then he looked at her. "You could have left me there," he said. "No one would have blamed you. No one even knows you came." "No," she agreed. He looked at her a long moment in the growing light. Something shifted in his gray eyes. Not gratitude exactly, something heavier. The beginning of a debt that had no clean shape yet. "Where does this road go?" "North," she said. "There's a village. A woman there owes my teacher a kindness. She'll shelter us, no questions." He turned back to the road, reached up, took the roan's reins. Then he held out his other hand to help her mount. She stared at it a moment. That large, scarred hand extended toward her, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for a king to offer a servant girl a hand up onto a horse. She took it. And they rode north into a pale and trembling dawn, while behind them, somewhere deep in the castle's stone belly, was descending a staircase, reaching a door and finding a room with 2 broken chains and no king inside. They rode until the sun cleared the tree line and the world stopped feeling like something that might collapse under her at any moment. Kale said little. Ren understood why. Every mile put behind them cost him something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he held the reins, the shallow discipline of his breathing. He was a man rationing his own strength the way a starving man rations bread. Small pieces. No waste. She watched him from the corner of her eye and thought about all the things Zelda had taught her about pain. How some men wear it loudly, using it as leverage, as performance, as a way of making sure everyone around them knows exactly what it's and how the more dangerous kind wear it silently, because silence lets them keep deciding what happens next instead of letting the pain decide for them. Kale was the second kind, which was, she thought, going to make it very hard to know when he was actually about to fall off that horse. The road narrowed as the trees thickened. Pale birches gave way to darker pine, and the air took on the mineral cold of higher ground. Somewhere behind them, a long way behind them now, a bell had begun to ring, faint, distant, carried strangely on the wind the way sound travels over open country in the hour just after dawn. Ren's whole body went rigid. "That's the castle," she said. "Yes." "They've found the cell." "Yes." His voice was flat, unbothered, or performing unbothered so well she couldn't tell the difference. "Draven will assume I'm dead in the woods somewhere. Or dying. He won't send riders in force yet. Not until he's certain which story serves him better. And if he decides the second story serves him better." Kale turned his head and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet, something almost like approval. "Then he sends riders," he said. "And we should already be somewhere they can't easily find." They picked up the pace. By mid-morning the horse was tired and so was Ren, though she would not have said so aloud even if someone held a blade to her throat and demanded it. Her back ached in places she didn't have names for. Her hands, gripping the reins, had gone numb somewhere around the second hour and stayed that way. She reflected grimly, entirely unsuited to being a fugitive. "Except you're doing it anyway," said a small stubborn voice in the back of her mind, "because someone has to. Because you already decided that someone was you, 3 hours before dawn, in a room that smelled like iron and rot. So stop complaining about your hands and pay attention to the road." She paid attention to the road. They stopped once briefly at a stream where the water ran fast and clear over gray stones. Kale dismounted first, slowly, carefully, like a man testing the structural integrity of his own body before committing his full weight to it, and knelt to drink. Ren knelt beside him, cupped water in her hands. "Drank. You should rest," she said. "We don't have time." You'll have less time if you fall off that horse 3 miles from here. He looked at her sideways. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. You speak to me the way you'd speak to a stubborn patient. You are a stubborn patient, I'm a king. Right now, Ren said, wringing water from her sleeve. You're a man with 2 cracked ribs, chain scars deep enough to keep for life, and a body that spent days being systematically starved by people who wanted you too weak to fight back. Kings can afford dignity, patients can't. Silence, then Lo, almost surprised at himself. No one has spoken to me like that in years. Would you like me to stop? No, he said. And this time the almost smile made it all the way to his eyes. I find I don't mind it at all. They rested for 10 minutes, not longer. Ren counted them, the way she'd counted stairs the night before. Because counting was the only thing that kept the fear at a manageable distance, fear that Draven's men were already closer than the ringing bell suggested. Fear that she had made a catastrophic miscalculation somewhere in the last 12 hours. Fear that this whole desperate gamble would end with both of them face down in some nameless ditch before the week was out. 10 minutes. Then they rode again. The village of Ashmere appeared out of the trees a little past midday, not much to look at. A scatter of low stone buildings with moss-dark thatch, a well at the center of a square, more mud than cobblestone. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys. A dog barked once behind a fence, then quieted. The kind of place that exists in the spaces between important places. The kind of place no lord bothers mapping, because it produces nothing a lord would want. Ren had been here twice before, both times with Iselda, and both times she'd felt the particular relief of arriving somewhere with no expectations of her at all. Maeve met them at the edge of the village as though she'd been expecting them. Which perhaps she had. She was small, sharp-eyed, somewhere past 60 winters, with white hair cropped close and hands permanently stained with ink from cataloging remedies in her own cramped script. Once, long before the guilds formalized everything, she had served as a field healer during the border conflicts, the kind of healer who learns to work fast, work quiet, and ask no questions about how a wound was earned. She looked at Kale the way experienced healers look at serious injuries, without flinching, with immediate calculation. Iselda's girl, she said to Ren, then to Kale, and you are larger than reported, and in worse condition than I'd like. She turned without waiting for a response. Come inside. Both of you, before someone in this village decides you're interesting enough to talk about. The cottage had 2 rooms and a loft, and it smelled of dried rosemary, wood smoke, and something faintly sweet Ren couldn't immediately place. Maeve put Kale by the fire and began her examination with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd stopped being impressed by rank or size a very long time ago. Kale submitted to it with more patience than Ren expected, though she noticed the way his jaw tightened when Maeve pressed carefully along his ribs. Too cracked, Maeve said, without particular drama. Not broken. You'll breathe shallow for a fortnight and you won't like it. But you'll breathe. She glanced up. What else? He was quiet a moment. My strength, he said finally. The chains were treated, some kind of compound worked into the iron. Maeve's eyes sharpened. She looked at Ren. Ren understood immediately what the look was asking. She thought back to the dungeon, to the smell beneath the iron and the damp, something sharp, something resinous, something that had pricked at the edge of her memory without ever fully surfacing. Dusk root, she said slowly. Possibly mixed with something else. It suppresses the bond between body and wolf nature. It's rare, Maeve said, difficult to source. And it doesn't grow anywhere near this castle. She let that sit in the room a moment before adding, quieter, which means whoever used it either traveled a long way to get it, or already had it waiting. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Kale said, but Ren saw his hands, resting on his knees, press briefly against the fabric of his breeches, a small, controlled movement, the kind that happens when a thought arrives a person isn't ready to say out loud yet. Draven, Ren thought. But Draven is a brutal man. Not a subtle one. Brutal men don't know about Duskroot. Brutal men have help. She didn't say it. Not yet. She filed it carefully in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed to be returned to. Maeve gave Kale the loft. Gave Ren a pallet near the fire. And somewhere in what remained of the day, exhaustion finally caught up with both of them, dragging them under in the particular, dreamless way that only comes when a body has genuinely reached its limit and simply refuses to negotiate further. Ren woke to gray morning light and the smell of barley porridge. Kale was already awake, seated at Maeve's small table with several sheets of rough parchment spread in front of him and a stick of charcoal in his hand. He was drawing. No, she realized as she came closer, he was reconstructing the layout of the castle, rendered from memory with a precision that startled her. Every corridor, every gate, every guard post she recognized. He didn't look up when she approached. You were right about Draven, he said. He didn't act alone. She sat across from him. Who else? Lord Harrow holds the Eastern Garrisons, 300 men who answer to him before they answer to the crown. The charcoal moved steadily. Draven has the council. Harrow has the swords. Together that's enough to hold the castle through a transition of power. A pause longer than the last. Enough at least to make my absence look permanent, and the rest of the council the ones who didn't join them. He was quiet a moment. Lord Bastion, of the Northern March. Cautious, not corrupt, he wouldn't have consented to this a beat. But he believes I'm dead or close enough to it. Without proof otherwise he won't move against Draven. He can't afford the risk. Ren looked at the map. At the castle rendered in charcoal, corridors and towers and gates exactly where she knew them to be. Then at the space outside the walls, the roads, the villages, the distances between one loyalty and the next. Bastion is what? She said slowly. 2 days hard from here. Kel looked up. You're suggesting I go to him? I'm suggesting, she said carefully, that a dead king who isn't actually dead, arriving in person at the keep of a lord who is loyal but frightened is a great deal more persuasive than a rumor or a letter. She paused. Bastion needs to see you alive. Upright. Not something that can be disbelieved or ignored. The silence that followed had a particular texture. The texture of a man reevaluating something he'd already decided. Kale set down the charcoal, looked at the map, then passed it at something Ren couldn't see, some internal landscape where he was already moving pieces. You have a strategic mind, he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. More an observation made with faint surprise, the kind of surprise a person reveals before they've thought to conceal it. I've had a quiet life, Ren said. Quiet lives make good observers. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. The shadow of one, perhaps the suggestion that somewhere beneath the weight he carried, the capacity for it still existed. Outside the wind had picked up, moving through the thatch and long. Somewhere behind them, 2 days' ride and a lifetime away, a castle stood under a banner that no longer meant what it used to mean, and a man named Draven sat in a stolen chair, believing for now that the hardest part of his plan was already finished. He was wrong. And Ren, sitting at a scarred wooden table in a healer's cottage at the edge of the world, charcoal dust on her face and fate, suddenly terrifyingly bound up with her own, understood for the first time exactly how wrong he was about to discover himself to be. They stayed in Ashmere through the day, resting in the deliberate way that people do, when they know the next stretch of road will not permit rest again for some time. Maeve fed them, changed the dressing on Kale's forearms, and said little, though Ren caught her watching Kale more than once with the particular narrow attention of a woman doing arithmetic she hadn't shared aloud yet. Toward evening, while Kale was outside checking the roan, Maeve found Ren alone by the fire. You know what you've done, Maeve said. Not a question, I know what I've started, not the same thing. Maeve sat, joints creaking, and studied her with those sharp old eyes. You've pulled a king out of a grave someone else dug for him. That doesn't end when you reach Bastion's gate, girl. That doesn't end when the crown sits back where it belongs. Men like Draven don't forgive the hands that undid their work. And men like your king. She paused, choosing the word deliberately, watching Ren's face for the reaction to it. Don't forget them either. You understood nothing. I understand, Ren said, that I didn't have a choice. Everyone always has a choice, Maeve said, not unkindly. You simply made the harder one. That's rarer than you think. Rare enough that it changes things. Rare enough that it changes people. She stood, joints protesting again, and moved back toward her hearth without waiting for a response. The conversation apparently complete on her end, the way all of Maeve's most important conversations seemed to be. Ren sat a long moment by the fire, turning the words over. Because she's right. Because you didn't think past tonight, past this road, past the simple animal fact of a man breathing when he shouldn't have been. Because you built a plan out of clay pots and stolen keys, and you never once asked yourself what happens on the other side of it. If there is another side, if any of this actually works. Which is either very brave or very foolish. And you genuinely don't know which one yet. Outside the wind had died down to nothing, and the sky above Ashmere had gone the deep, star-scattered black particular to places far from any city's glow. Ren found Kale standing near the roan, one hand resting against its flank, looking north toward the road they hadn't yet ridden, toward Bastion's keep and everything waiting beyond it. She came to stand beside him, didn't speak at first. Let the silence hold what it needed to hold. You're thinking about the castle, she said finally. I'm thinking about the men inside it who believed, this morning, that I was already dead. He didn't look at her. There's a particular kind of relief that comes with being underestimated. Draven has spent years assuming I was exactly what my father made me look like. Predictable. Reactive, a soldier king, good for wars and little, a pause. He never planned for a man who might survive what he did to me. And he certainly never planned for the reason I did. Now he did look at her, he said simply. As though the word itself were an explanation complete in itself. Ren felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. I did what anyone would have done. She said no. His voice was quiet, certain. You did what almost no one would have done. There's a difference, and I think you know it even if you'd rather not say it out loud. He turned back toward the north road. My father used to say that a kingdom reveals itself in its smallest moments, not in the great hall. Not in the treaties or the wars. In a dungeon corridor at 3 hours before dawn, when no one is watching and there's nothing to gain. He was quiet a moment. I intend to remember that this castle, when it mattered most, produced you. Ren didn't know how to answer that, so she didn't try. She simply stood beside him in the dark, listening to the roan shift its weight, watching her own breath fog faintly in the cold night air, and let the silence between them settle into something that felt for the first time since the dungeon, almost like solid ground. It wouldn't last, she knew that even then. Somewhere behind them, a bell had rung at dawn, and men were already moving. And Duskroot didn't grow near this castle by accident, and some hand she hadn't yet identified had cleared a passage through the cistern chamber before she and Kale had ever set foot in it. Too many threads left hanging. But tonight at least, they were both still breathing. And for the first time in a very long time, Ren allowed herself to believe that might actually be enough to build something on. They left Ashmere before first light, riding hard through country that grew colder and thinner with every mile north. KL set the pace with the particular discipline of a man who had spent years learning how to move quickly through hostile land, and Ren, who had spent most of her life within the walls of a single castle and a single healer's workroom, discovered new and inventive ways for her body to ache. She said nothing about it. Pride mostly, partly the sense that complaining about saddle sores felt obscene, next to a man riding with cracked ribs, and a chest full of stubbornness holding him upright. By midday of the second day, the trees had thinned into open moorland, gray-green and endless, and the mountains that marked the northern march rose in the distance like a wall the world had built to keep something in or something out. It was somewhere on that empty stretch of road, with no cover for a mile in any direction, that they heard the horses behind them. Kale's head turned first. Ren felt it before she understood it, the sudden total stillness in him, the shift from a man riding to a man calculating. How many, she asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. Too many to outrun on tired horses, he said. And too far to be certain who they serve. Except it doesn't matter who they serve, Ren thought, pulse climbing. Because if it's Draven's men, we're finished before we've even reached Bastion. And if it's Harrow's, it's worse, and if it's neither there, Kale said, cutting through the spiral with 2 words and a nod to a fold in the land ahead, a shallow gully, half hidden by scrub, running roughly parallel to the road now. They moved. And Ren understood, urging her exhausted horse down into the gully beside him, heart hammering in time with hoofbeats she couldn't yet identify, that whatever safety they'd found in Ashmere had already run out. The road ahead was no longer simply long, it was hunted. The riders passed within 200 yards of the gully and never once slowed. Ren counted the hoofbeats the way she'd counted stairs, the way she'd counted doors. Because counting was the only thing keeping her hands from shaking hard enough to spook the horses. And spooked horses in a gully with armed men on the road above them was not a mistake either of them could survive. 20, 30, 40 riders. Too many for a routine patrol. Too disciplined for a hunting party thrown together in a pick. Which meant someone had planned this before the alarm bell ever rang. She pressed herself flat against the roan's neck and watched the underside of the sky through a screen of dead grass. And somewhere beside her Kale had gone utterly, unnervingly still. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of a man doing math with other men's lives. The hoofbeats faded, then vanished entirely into the wind. Neither of them moved for a long time after that. Harrow's colors, Kale said finally low. You saw them? I didn't need to. His jaw was tight. No one else in this kingdom moves 40 riders in a straight line without stopping to check a single farmhouse. That's Gerson discipline. That's Harrow then? He already knows you're alive. Or he's making certain I'm not. Kale's eyes tracked the empty road a moment longer, as if daring it to prove him wrong. Either way, we've lost the luxury of moving slowly, except slowly was already gone. The second the bell rang, Ren thought, climbing back into the saddle with legs that did not want to hold her weight. Except there was never a version of this where we had time. There was only ever the illusion of it for about a day in a healer's cottage that smelled like rosemary, and now that's gone too, so stop mourning it. They rode. The land climbed steadily for the rest of that day. Moorland giving way to broken hills. Hills giving way to the first gray shoulders of real mountain. The air thinned. The wind found new and more inventive angles from which to cut through wool cloaks that had never been made for this kind of cold. Kale rode with his jaw set and his breathing careful, and Wren watched him from the corner of her eye the way she'd watched Patience for 6 years cataloging the small signs before they became large ones. The way his right hand occasionally drifted unconsciously toward his ribs. The way his color had gone from pale to something grayer, something that worried her more than the bruising ever had. "We should stop," she said, somewhere in the third hour past the gully. "We can't. You'll fall off that horse before we reach Bastion's gate if we don't." "I won't. You said that in Ashmere too." He glanced at her, something flickered at the corner of his mouth despite everything. "You keep a record of every wrong thing I say?" "Someone has to. You certainly aren't doing it." "I'm a king. Kings don't keep records of their own mistakes." "Then it's a good thing," Wren said, "that you have me." He didn't answer that. But he did, 20 minutes later, without being asked again, slow the run's pace half a length, small enough that he could pretend it wasn't a concession, large enough that Wren noticed anyway and said nothing. Because saying something would have made him stop doing it out of pure stubbornness. Men, she thought. Kings especially. You cannot ask them to take care of themselves directly. You have to trick them into it and let them believe it was their own idea the whole time, which fine, whatever gets his ribs to Bastion's gate in one piece. They made camp that night in a stand of pine at the edge of the true foothills. No fire, no light, nothing that might carry across open country to eyes that shouldn't find them. Wren checked Kale's dressings by feel in the dark, fingers reading the shape of the wound, the way Iselda had taught her to read anything when there was no lamp to spare. "Worse," she said quietly. "How much worse?" "Enough that I'd want a proper poultice if we had the luxury of stopping long enough to make one. We don't." "I'm aware," she finished binding it, working blind, and sat back on her heels in the cold dark. "I'm simply telling you the truth. You asked me once to soften things. I'm holding you to it." A pause. Then quieter than she expected. "Good." They didn't speak much after that. The cold settled in properly once the last gray light drained out of the sky, and Wren found herself, despite every instinct toward propriety, sitting close enough to Kale that she could feel the warmth radiating off him. Borrowed body heat being the only kind of heat either of them could afford tonight. This is practical, she told herself. This is not anything else. This is two people trying not to freeze on a mountainside. And if my heart is doing something ridiculous about the fact that his shoulder is against mine, that is a private and deeply inconvenient fact that nobody else needs to know about, least of him. Except he shifted closer too. Just slightly. Just enough that it couldn't have been an accident. Which means either he's cold as well, which is likely, given the ribs and the blood loss and the general condition of a man who was chained to a wall days ago. Or, no, don't finish that thought. You have a king to deliver alive to a lord who might not even believe he's real. This is not the moment for or. She closed her eyes and made herself breathe evenly until sleep finally mercifully took the choice away from her. Morning came gray and hard, frost silvering every blade of grass in the little clearing, and they were moving again before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline. By mid-morning of the third day since the dungeon, Bastion's keep rose out of the mist ahead of them, low, broad, gray stone. Built by someone who understood, generations ago, that the north wind does not care about architecture, does not care about towers reaching for cares only about what survives. Wren felt something in her chest loosen slightly at the sight of it. Not relief exactly, something more cautious than relief. The feeling of a destination finally becoming real after 2 days of believing in it purely on faith. The gate guard who met them at the outer wall looked at them with the particular weary suspicion of a man who has stood at a cold gate for several hours and found nothing yet worth his generosity. A large man in a plain servant's cloaks, a small woman in travel-worn gray. One horse between them, no escort. No visible credentials of any kind. Stage business, the guard said. Kale's voice, when it came, had shifted. Wren heard it happen, the same voice, but with something unsheathed beneath it now. Something that hadn't been fully present in Maeve's cottage or on the road. Authority that didn't need to be loud to be felt. "We require an audience with Lord Bastion, your name." A beat, long enough that the guard's certainty, already thin, began visibly to fray at the edges. "Tell him," Kale said, "that the wolf has returned from the deep." They were brought inside within minutes. Bastion himself appeared before Wren had finished counting the tapestries in the entry hall. A lean man well past 60, winters, close-cropped white beard, The kind of posture that speaks of a lifetime spent inside armor even when the armor itself was long put away. He stopped in the doorway of his great hall and looked at Kale for a long moment, his expression moving through several stages too quickly for Ren to catalog them all. What settled at the end, on a man clearly unaccustomed to it, looked remarkably like relief. "My king," he bent his knee. Kale crossed the room in 4 strides and put a hand on the old lord's shoulder, drawing him back upright before the gesture could fully complete itself. "Not yet," he said quietly, "not until this is finished. But you're alive." Bastian's voice cracked slightly on the word, an old soldier's composure briefly overwhelmed by something he clearly hadn't allowed himself to feel in days. "Whatever they told us. Whatever Draven's riders claimed. You're alive, I am." Kale's grip tightened once on Fonzon's shoulder then released. "And I intend to stay that way, which is why I'm here." What followed was 2 hours in Bastian's council, a chamber that smelled of old parchment and tallow mountains, air seeping through every window no matter how tightly the shutters were drawn. Kale laid out everything with the same precision he'd used on Maeve's scattered parchment. Draven's council seats, Harrow's 300 swords, the timeline of the coup, the dungeon, the chains, the compound worked into the iron that Maeve had confirmed was Duskroot. Bastians listened with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly how much the quality of his listening, in this moment, would determine everything that followed. His captain stood beside him throughout, a woman named Ysolde, broad-shouldered, sharp-featured, a scar running from her left ear to the corner of her jaw, watching Kale with a soldier's evaluating eye. Somewhere in the second hour she began asking questions of her own. Good questions. The kind that cut straight past sentiment to logistics, timing the specific mechanics of what reclaiming a castle would actually require in men, in supplies, in days. Kale answered each one directly. "The eastern garrison is Harrow's 300, he said. "We cannot go through them. We go around. We moved before Draven realized me." "He'll know already," Ysolde said flatly. "Word travels. He'll have sent riders the moment the cell was found empty." "We already met some of those riders," Kale said. "2 south of here, 40 men, moving in garrison formation." Ysolde's eyes sharpened. "Then he's not guessing anymore. He's hunting with intent." "Then we have less time than I'd like," Kale said. "And more need for speed than is comfortable." His eyes moved briefly to Ren, quick, nothing more. But Bastian caught it. Ren saw the old lord's gaze follow that glance with quiet, careful attention, filing it away the way old men who have survived a great many courts learn to file away things they aren't yet ready to comment on aloud. "How did you get out of that cell?" Bastian asked. Kale was quiet a moment, he said. "Just her name, as though it were, in itself, a complete answer." Bastian looked at her. Ysolde looked at her. Ren looked back at both of them and said nothing, because there was nothing left to add that Kale hadn't already folded into that single word. Which is strange, she thought, standing very still under the weight of 2 strangers' sudden attention. "Because I've spent my entire life being the person no one looks at directly, and now an old lord and his captain are looking at me like I might actually matter to whatever happens next. I don't know what to do with that, so do what you always do. Say nothing, watch. Wait until it's useful to speak." Bastian had 80 men. 80 was not 300. But Ysolde pointed out, with the calm pragmatism of someone who had clearly spent considerable time solving problems with inadequate resources, that Harrow's 300 were stationed at the Easter garrison, a full day's ride from Ravengard. If Bastian's men moved fast enough, they could reach the castle before Harrow's swords could be recalled. The castle's internal guard, the men who answered directly to the crown, rather than to any single lord, numbered around 40. The real question was where their loyalty sat now, with the crown apparently vacant and Draven's faction controlling every visible lever of power. "There's a man named Torin," Ren said, and several heads turned toward her. She kept her voice level. "He served the castle for 40 years. He let me into the dungeon that night." She paused. "He didn't do that 'cause he supports Draven." Ysolde's sharp eyes cut to Kale. A contact inside, a possibility. Kale was looking at Ren, and there was something in his expression she was slowly, and somewhat unwillingly, becoming able to read. A particular quality of attention he gave to things he considered important. "Ren would need to make contact before we arrive, alone, ahead of the main party." The room went quiet in a specific, careful way. "That's a considerable risk," Sten said. "I know the castle," Ren said. "I know the passages, I know how to move through it without being seen." She met Kale's eyes across the table. "I've already done it once. If Draven's men recognize you," she said, cutting him off. And it wasn't suspicion in her voice this time, just fact, laid flat on the table like a blade. "That's always been the assumption. I'm choosing for once to use it." Another silence. Isolde made a sound that might have been approval, or might have been the specific sound a soldier makes when they recognize an argument they can't effectively counter. Kale held Ren's gaze a long moment. The gray of his eyes in the candlelight of Bastian's council room was darker than it had been in the dungeon. Storm color. The shade that comes just after a decision is made rather than just before. You come back, he said. Not quite an order. Something between the with an edge Ren felt more than heard. I intend to, she said. But that plan, the simple, dangerous, clean plan of Ren riding ahead alone to find Torin and secure the West Gate did not survive the next morning intact. It fractured on a single piece of information Isolde brought to the council table at first light, delivered with the flat, careful precision of a soldier who has learned that bad news doesn't improve with softening. I sent a rider south last night, Isolde said, quietly, to confirm the position of Harrow's men. He came back an hour ago. She paused. Draven's already moved. He's tightened the guard rotation inside Ravengard. Doubled the men at every gate. And he's pulled half the kitchen staff and half the stable hands into the east wing under lock, officially for questioning about the escape. Ren felt something cold settle low in her stomach. Torin, she said. I don't have his name specifically, Isolde said. But an old gate watchman matching that description is among those being held for questioning. Which means, Ren thought, and the spiral started before she could stop it, which means which means the moment I arrive at that West Gate expecting his help, there might not be anyone there to give it. Which means the entire plan, the plan I built, the plan I promised Kale I could execute, might already be a plan built on a man who's sitting in a locked room right now, being asked increasingly unfriendly questions by increasingly unfriendly people. Stop. Breathe. You don't know that yet. You know he's being held for questioning. You don't know he's confessed anything. You don't know he's told them a single true word, except you don't know that he hasn't either. We need another way in, Kale said, cutting cleanly through the noise in her head the way he seemed increasingly able to do. If Torin's compromised or even simply unreachable, the Westgate plan collapses. We need a second option, before we commit riders to it. Bastian frowned over the map now spread across his table, Kale's charcoal reconstruction, copied more neatly onto proper parchment overnight by one of Bastian's scribes. What about the merchant road? Bastian said slowly. The southern approach, slower but less watched. If Draven's tightened every formal gate, he may not have thought to tighten the routes that aren't gates at all. The grain deliveries, Ren said, something clicking into place. There's a covered cart route that comes up from the southern farms twice a week. It goes straight into the inner ward through the kitchen yard. No formal gate at all, just a low wall and an old wooden door that's rarely even locked, 'cause nobody's ever thought a wagon full of turnips was worth guarding. Isolde looked at her with new interest. You know the schedule? Come and go for 6 years, Ren said. I know exactly when it arrives. I know exactly which farms send which carts. And I know, she added, quieter, that the man who drives the largest one owes my teacher a debt for saving his daughter's life 2 winters ago. Silence around the table. Kale looked at her the way he'd looked at her in Maeve's cottage, over the charcoal map. Faint surprise, sharpening into something else. You keep finding doors nobody else can see, he said. I've spent my whole life learning where the doors are, Ren said simply, since no one ever bothered opening any of the obvious ones for me. The new plan took shape through the rest of that day, argued over piece by piece across Bastille until every seams had been tested and found, if not perfect, at least sound enough to risk lives on. Ren would go ahead, alone, disguised before the invisible woman in gray wool, carrying a basket, moving through a world that had trained itself for years not to look at her directly. She would ride the last stretch on foot, joining the flow of morning traffic near the southern farms, and slip into the Graert route as though she'd always belonged there. Once inside, 2 objectives. Find Torin if he could be found and if it was safe to try. And find out quietly precisely what state the castle's internal guard was actually and how many men remained loyal in fact rather than merely in memory, and how many had already, in a handful of short days, made their peace with serving whoever currently held the steward's chair. Bastian's 80 men meanwhile would move north and east in a wide loop, avoiding the main road entirely, aiming to arrive at Ravengard's outer approach roughly a day and a half after Ren's departure, enough time, in theory, for her to have gathered what they needed and gotten word back out. In theory, Isolde repeated when Kale laid out the timing. Which is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. It's the zone sentence we have, Castle said. Ren watched the exchange with a strange, distant clarity, the way she imagined a person might watch weather forming over a mountain they were about to have to walk across. This was real now. Not a fevered plan built in 3 hours before dawn, born of adrenaline and a clay pot of salve. This was 80 men and a captain with a scarred jaw and an old lord who had bent his knee to a king he genuinely believed was dead. All of it now arranged, piece by careful piece, around a 19-word sentence she'd spoken in a dungeon days ago. Because no one should be left to disappear quietly, not even a king, and now, she thought, look at what that sentence has become. That night, Bastien gave them each a room, a genuine luxury after nights of cold ground and stolen sleep. And Wren found herself standing in a stone chamber with an actual bed in it, staring at the closed door as though she'd forgotten how doors worked when they weren't cell doors or hidden passage doors. A knock came before she'd fully processed the strangeness of it. Cale stood in the corridor when she opened it. He'd changed into borrowed clothes that fit him poorly across the shoulders. Bastien's men ran smaller than he did, and for a moment standing there in ill-fitting wool with his dark hair still damp from washing, he looked less like a king and more simply like a very large, very tired man. I wanted to see you before tomorrow, he said. You're seeing me. The corner of his mouth twitched. You've developed a habit of making things difficult for me to say. I've developed a habit, Wren said, of not letting people hide behind formality when they clearly want to say something else. He was quiet a moment, studying her in the low torchlight of the corridor. You could refuse this, he said finally. The grain cart. The castle. All of it. Bastien has 80 men. He doesn't need a single healer's apprentice risking her life on a cart full of turnips to make this work. You don't believe that, Wren said. Not really. You said it yourself in the council room. Without eyes inside, you're marching 80 men blind into a castle that might have 300 more waiting behind those walls than anyone accounts for. I know that, Cale said. It doesn't mean I have to like sending you to find out. Something in his voice had shifted, the careful control fraying slightly at the edges, just enough for her to glimpse what sat beneath it. You didn't strike me, Wren said slowly, as a man who worries about sending people into danger. You're a king. Presumably you've sent men to die before. I have. His jaw tightened. It's never felt like this. The words landed in the narrow stone corridor and simply sat there, and Wren felt her pulse do something complicated and inconvenient in response to them. Don't, she told herself. Don't read anything into 4 words spoken by an exhausted man standing in a doorway at the end of the worst week of his life. He's grateful, that's all this is. Gratitude wearing a heavier coat than it needs to, except it doesn't sound like gratitude. Gratitude doesn't make a king's voice crack on the word felt. Except you don't actually know what gratitude sounds like from a king, because you've never had one grateful to you before this week. So maybe you're simply wrong about what you're hearing. Except I'll come back, she said out loud, cutting off the spiral before it could finish devouring itself. I told you that once already. I meant it then, I mean it now. Cale held her eyes a long moment. See that you do, he said quietly. And then, before either of them could turn the moment into something neither was ready to tame, he stepped back, inclined his head slightly, something between a bow and a promise, and disappeared down the corridor toward his own room, leaving Wren standing alone in her doorway, with her heart doing something she didn't have a name for yet, and wasn't at all sure she wanted one. She left before dawn. The gray mare Bastien's stablemaster provided moved quietly, steady-footed, unbothered by cold or darkness, the kind of horse built for exactly this sort of work, unremarkable and unhurried. Wren rode alone into a morning that hadn't yet decided whether it would be gray or gold. Her borrowed servant's cloak pulled close, a basket of dried herbs across her lap in case anyone asked what business a woman alone might have on this road. No one asked. That was, as always, the entire strategy. By mid-morning she'd left the mare tethered at a farmstead 2 miles south of Ravengard, paying the farmer's wife with 2 of Iselda's finest willowbark twists for the privilege of borrowing a spot in the yard and asking no questions. She joined the grain carts on foot from there, falling into step beside a boy no older than 14 leading the second wagon's ox team, and let herself become, once again, exactly what 6 years of practice had taught her to become. Furniture background, nothing worth a second glance. The castle rose ahead of her as the morning traffic thickened. Ravengard, exactly as large and complete and indifferent as she remembered, the wolf banner still flying above the main gate, as though nothing at all had changed in the days since she'd fled it in the dark with a king on her arm. Except everything has changed, she thought, watching that banner snap in the wind. You just can't see it from here. You have to get inside the walls to find where the cracks actually are. The kitchen yard door was exactly as she'd promised Bastien's council, barely watched at all. A single guard stood near it, more interested in the warmth of a nearby brazier than in the slow procession of turnip carts creaking past him into the yard. Wren kept her head down, her basket steady against her hip, and walked through the gate of the castle she'd escaped days ago as though she had never once left it. No one looked at her twice. Finding Torrin took longer than she'd hoped, and every hour of searching frayed her nerves a little further. She learned, from careful sideways conversation in the serfs, a question here, an overheard complaint there. Never anything direct enough to be remembered later that Isolde's information had been correct. Torrin had indeed been pulled in for questioning 3 days ago, along with a handful of other older staff. The theory that someone with long-standing access to the lower passages must have had a hand in the king's disappearance. But he had not been held. Not formally. Whatever answers he'd given his questioners, they'd apparently been sufficient to send him back to his usual post at the gate, a post he now shared uncomfortably with 2 of Draven's own men, watching him as closely as he watched the door. Which meant Wren realized with a cold twist in her stomach that Torrin was no longer simply an old, useful loyalties. He was a suspect being watched, and approaching him directly, the way she'd approached him days ago with a story about scratching in the walls, would now be watched too. So find another way, she told herself, moving through the lower corridors, with her basket and her borrowed invisibility. Find someone else who can carry a message for you. Someone no one is watching. Someone who has no reason at all to be suspected of anything. She found that someone entirely by accident, in the 3rd hour of her search, crouched beside a fire in the servants' kitchen, peeling turnips with the particular boneless exhaustion of a boy who has been awake since before dawn. Finn, the stable boy, the one who'd slept through the entire escape in the loft, mouth open, entirely oblivious. He looked up as she passed, and something in his face changed, recognition, quickly suppressed. He'd clearly heard in the days since exactly what had happened in that stable, the night the king disappeared, and exactly who might have led him through it. Wren didn't stop walking. But as she passed close by his fire, she let her basket brush his shoulder and dropped low enough that only he could hear it. 4 words meant for a man he trusted more than any noble in this castle. Tell Torrin Westgate tonight. Finn didn't look up, didn't nod, didn't give any sign at all that he'd heard her. But 3 hours later, crossing the inner yard on her way back toward the kitchen door, Wren caught the boy's eye across the courtyard for exactly 1 second, and he blinked twice deliberately, before looking away. Message delivered. It was on her way back toward the kitchen yard, message sent, half the day's work already done, that Wren's carefully constructed invisibility finally cracked. She felt it before she understood it, the particular unmistakable sensation of a hand closing around her upper arm from behind, firm, certain, entirely unhurried. The grip of someone who has done this before and expects no resistance. She went very still. The man who held her was one she didn't recognize. Not castle guard. Not servant. The kind of man who appears in the retinue of lords like Draven and doesn't carry a title but serves a very clear function. Lord Draven wants to speak with the girl, he said, who was seen in the lower passages the night before the king vanished. The cold that moved through Wren then had nothing to do with the mountain air. It was the cold of understanding all at once, and far too late, that the one flaw in invisibility is that it only works until someone decides, specifically and deliberately, to look. Breathe, she told herself, as the man's grip steered her firmly toward the east wing, toward a part of the castle she had never once had reason to enter in 6 years of quiet service. Breathe. Because whatever happens in the next hour, panic reveals what you're protecting. Stillness reveals nothing. You know this, Iselda taught you this. Use it now, or you're going to get yourself and everyone riding north for you killed. Lord Draven's receiving chamber had until recently belonged to the castle steward. Wren knew this because she'd been in it before, carrying remedies for old Steward Pell's gout, back when it smelled of dust and ledgers and the particular exhaustion of a man who managed too many things for too little recognition. Now it smelled of Draven. Expensive candles. Fur trimmed into everything. The slightly overheated quality of a room occupied by someone who had decided somewhere along the way that he deserved more warmth than other men. He was seated at the steward's old table as though it were a throne, and spread across it. Wren's eyes caught this before she could stop them. Before she could arrange her face into the careful blankness the moment demanded, were documents. Formal ones, wax not yet fully hardened, chains of succession. Written in a hand she didn't recognize, in language she recognized instantly, because she'd read enough of Iselda's old legal texts to know exactly what a formal transfer of crown authority looked like on paper. He's forging the succession, she thought, and the shock of it nearly broke through the stillness she'd promised herself she'd hold. He's not simply hoping people believe Kael is dead. He's already writing the documents that will make it official, which means he's further along than any of us realized. Which means Bastion's 80 men might already be riding into something worse than we planned for. Draven looked up. His narrow, precise face, the face of a man who had compensated for physical smallness with an exhaustive cultivation of every other kind of power. Political, financial, informational, settled into an expression of mild, confident irritation. The look of a man dealing with a minor obstacle he's expected to remove without much effort. "The Omega Healer's girl," he said. Not unfriendly, somehow that was worse. "Sit down," she sat. Refusing would have told him something he didn't yet need to know. The man who'd brought her stationed himself behind her chair. "You were seen," Draven said, entering the lower passage the night before last. Coming back up alone. He folded his hands atop the forged documents, as though covering them were an afterthought rather than a deliberate choice. "And now here you are again, moving through my castle while half my staff whisper that you had some part in what happened to the king." The word "my" landed carefully, deliberately, and Ren filed it away alongside the sealed documents. "Where have you been, girl?" She let her voice come out smaller than it actually was. Let her hands clasp in her lap the way hands clasp when they're genuinely nervous. Because she was genuinely nervous. And there is a considerable difference between being frightened and showing it in a way someone can use against you. "I was frightened, my lord," she said. "I heard the other servants saying the king was unwell. I thought perhaps I could bring a remedy." She looked down. "A guard stopped me before I reached the cell. I left. I was afraid of being blamed for something. So I went to stay with a cousin in the lower village." Silence. She kept her eyes low and let the silence do its own work. Because the moment right after a lie is the most dangerous moment there is. And the correct response to it is never to fill it. "Which guard stopped you?" Draven asked. "I don't know his name, my lord." An older man, gray hair. Draven's eyes moved briefly to the man standing behind her chair. Something passed between them, a shift in attention, a small private weighing of possibilities Ren couldn't fully read. Then Draven leaned back. "The king," he said, almost pleasantly, "died in the night. A great sadness for the realm. The council will convene within the week to formalize the succession." Ren made her face grieve. It wasn't entirely performance. There was something genuinely sickening about hearing it delivered so cleanly, so urgent, as though a man's entire life could be closed out like a ledger entry balanced at the end of a quarter. "I'm very sorry, my lord."
"Yes."
He studied her a moment longer, something calculating moving behind his eyes. "You may go. But you'll remain within the castle walls. There will be arrangements in the coming days, and I require all staff present." She rose, curtsied with precisely the correct degree of deference. Walked to the door without running, because running was for people who had something to hide. And she was, as far as any casual observer could tell, nothing more than a frightened servant girl with a basket of herbs and a story about a cousin, entirely unremarkable in every way. She made it to the corridor, she made it to the inner yard. And then, the moment she was certain no one was watching closely enough to notice a change in her pace, she began moving very quickly indeed toward the kitchen yard door, because she had perhaps 2 hours before Draven's confidence hardened into either confirmation or genuine suspicion. And Bastion's men needed to know that everything, the timeline, the succession, the entire shape of the plan had just collapsed forward far faster than anyone at that council table had accounted for. Except getting out was the easy part. Except the hard part is what you carry with you. Because you just watched a man sign his own name to documents that will make him king in everything but ceremony within the week. And you cannot unknow that now. Which means the timeline isn't 2 days anymore. Which means it might not even be one. She reached the farmsteads as light was beginning to lean toward evening. The farmer's wife said nothing, only nodded toward the mare, tethered exactly where Ren had left her. And Ren was in the saddle and moving south before she'd fully caught her breath. She found Bastion's column faster than she expected, not because they'd covered more ground than planned, but because Kale, apparently unwilling or unable to wait at the keep for word to reach him, had ridden ahead of the main body with a small escort, closing the distance himself. He saw her before she reached them, broke from the front of the small group, at a pace that covered the space between them with startling speed, pulling his horse up short and swinging down before it had fully stopped. And then he was in front of her, hands closing on her shoulders, eyes moving over her face with an intensity that had nothing short about it at all. What happened? Not a question. A demand, and underneath it, something raw she hadn't heard from him before. "Draven had me brought to him," she said, still catching her breath. "I talked my way out. But he's moving faster than we thought." She met him. "He's already drafting the succession. Formal documents sealed. He means to present them to the council within the week." Something shifted hard behind Kale's gray eyes. "A week, maybe less. I don't know how close it is to finished." She forced herself to keep going to lay it all out before fear could steal the details. Torrin got my message. Westgate tonight if he can manage it. But Draven's watching him. I don't know if he'll be able to move at all. Then we don't wait for tonight, Kale said. We move now today. Behind him, one of the escort riders, a young man Ren didn't recognize, breathing hard from the pace they'd been keeping, spoke up carefully. Lord Bastion's main column is still hours out. If we move without them, then we move with what we have and trust the rest to catch us, Kale said, already turning back toward his horse. Because every hour we wait is an hour closer to Draven's name being the only name anyone in that council chamber is legally permitted to speak. Ren caught his arm before he could mount Kale. He stopped. Looked back at her. If we move too fast, she said, low urgent, we arrive with too few men and no element of surprise at all. Draven already suspects something. If he sees riders approaching before Bastion's full column is in position, he'll simply seal the gates and dare us to break them. And then this whole plan becomes a siege instead of a rescue. And sieges take weeks. We don't have weeks. Something warred behind his eyes, the soldier's instinct to act now. Immediately against the strategist's understanding that speed without support was simply a faster way to fail. Then what do you suggest, he said finally. And the fact that he asked it, the fact that days out from a dungeon, a king was asking a healer's apprentice what she suggested, was not lost on either of them, or on the young rider watching the exchange with wide, careful eyes. We ride to meet Bastion's column, Ren said. Now close the distance as fast as the horses allow. And when we arrive together, all 80 men and everyone Draven fears, we do it before he's had time to finish signing anything at all. Kale held her gaze a long moment. Then he nodded once and swung up into his saddle, he said. They closed the distance to Bastion's column within a few hours, pushing horses that had already given most of what they had, and found the old lord exactly where the plan had promised he'd be. 80 men moving in careful, disciplined formation along a route chosen specifically to avoid every eye that might carry word ahead of them. Bastion took the news of the forged succession documents with the flat, grim calm of a man who had seen a great many plans up slaps and had learned the hard way not to waste time being surprised by it. Then we move tonight, he said, not tomorrow. Tonight? Shisoldi was already reorganizing the column before he'd finished the sentence, calling instructions down the line with the crisp economy of someone who had clearly run this particular kind of calculation in her head more than once before. Ren found herself, in the chaos of preparation that followed, standing slightly apart from it all, a healer's apprentice, young soldiers, useful for a very specific set of skills but otherwise for the moment, simply watching a machine she'd helped set in motion begin to move under its own power. Kale found her there, near the edge of the column, checking the straps on her mare's saddle with hands that hadn't fully stopped shaking since the receiving chamber. You did well today, he said quietly. I nearly didn't get out at all. But you did. He studied her a moment. Do you understand what you walked into today? What it would have meant if Draven had decided in that room that a frightened servant girl's story wasn't quite frightened enough to be believed. I understand, Ren said. I understood it before I walked through that gate this morning. I did it anyway, I know. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, something heavier and more complicated than that. That's precisely what worries me. She looked up at him, at the gray eyes gone dark in the fading light, and felt, for one unguarded moment, the full weight of everything neither of them had said since the gully, since the shared warmth on a frozen mountainside, since a doorway in Bastion's keep where a king's voice had cracked on a four-word sentence he clearly hadn't planned to say aloud. This is not the moment, she told herself firmly. There are 80 men saddling horses 6 feet away from you. There is a forged succession document sitting on a table in a castle hours north of here. There is a boy named Finn who might even now be trying to deliver a message to a man who might already be under suspicion too heavy to survive it. This is not the moment for anything except the plan. So put it away. All of it. Put it away until there's a version of tomorrow where you're both still alive to have it. We should move, she said instead, out loud, and stepped back from him before either of them could say anything that couldn't be unsaid. Kale held her gaze one more second, then nodded, and turned back toward his horse, and the column began at last to move north through the gathering dark. They rode through the night, 80-odd riders moving as quietly as 80-odd riders can move, which is to say not quietly at all, but quietly enough in open country, far enough from any watching eyes that might carry word ahead. Ren rode near the front, beside Kale and just behind Isolde, and used the long cold hours to turn over everything she'd learned in Draven's receiving chamber, searching for the details she'd been too frightened in the moment to fully register. The documents were already sealed with wax, she thought. Not just drafted. Sealed. which means witnessed, which means at least one other person in that castle has already put their name or their signature to Draven's claim, which means this isn't Draven alone anymore if it ever was. He needed a witness. He needed someone with standing enough that a signature actually means something to the council. So who? Harrow, obviously. Harrow's swords are the muscle behind all of this. But Harrow's signature alone wouldn't be enough. Everyone on that council already knows Harrow answers to whoever controls the castle, not the other way around. His name on a document proves nothing except that he's chosen a side. It doesn't prove the claim itself is legitimate. So who else? Who has enough standing, enough neutrality, enough reputation for fairness that their signature could actually make a forged succession look real to lords who haven't yet chosen a side? She didn't have an answer, not yet. But the question sat in her chest like a stone all through the ride, heavy and cold and impossible to put down, because some instinct she didn't fully trust yet kept insisting that the answer, when it finally came, was going to matter more than almost anything else in this entire plan. Dawn found them within sight of Ravengard's western approach, the castle rising gray and enormous out of morning mist. The wolf banner still flying above the gate, exactly as it had every single morning of Ren's life before this week changed everything. Bastion called a halt in a fold of the land just out of sight of the walls, and the column settled into the tense, watchful stillness of soldiers waiting for a signal that hadn't come yet. If Torin managed to move, Isolde said quietly, studying the distant gate through the thinning mist, we'll see it soon. If he didn't, she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Ren stared at this west gate, small in the distance, and felt every hour of the last several days settled into her shoulders all at once, and thought, with a clarity that frightened her more than the fear itself, this is the part where it either works, or it doesn't. This is the part neither Bastion's 80 men nor Kale's authority, nor my own 6 years of careful invisibility can control anymore. This is simply the part where we wait and hope, and find out whether an old man's 40 years of quiet loyalty was enough to survive days of suspicious questioning. The mist thinned further, and somewhere along that distant gray wall so small it was almost impossible to be certain, a section of the west gate began slowly to swing open. Isolde's hand went up, the column tensed. That's him, Dren breathed, something in her chest unclenching for the first time in hours. That's Torin. Or, Kale said quietly, beside her, it's exactly what Draven wants us to believe it is. Words landed like cold water. Because he's right, Ren thought, the brief unclenching in her chest tightening right back into a fist. Because you don't actually know it's Torin from here. You know a gate is opening. That's all you know. And an open gate can be an invitation exactly as easily as it can be a trap, and there is genuinely no way to tell the difference until 80 men have already committed to riding through it. Bastion looked at Kyle. At Isolde. We need to know, the old lord said, before we send a single rider through that gate. Everyone turned without quite meaning to toward Ren. I'll go, she said before anyone could ask it of her directly. Alone, on foot, the way I went in yesterday. If it's Torin, I'll signal from the wall. If it's a trap, Kazel said, voice low and hard, you'll be walking directly into whatever Draven has waiting for us, alone with no one close enough to reach you in time. I know the risk, I know you know it. That doesn't mean I have to accept sending you into it this time in 2 days. You're not sending me, Ren said, meeting his eyes. I'm choosing it. There's a difference, and I think you know that too, even if you'd rather not say it out loud. The echo of his own words spoken back to him from a night days gone in a healer's cottage landed visibly. Something in his jaw tightened. Something in his eyes went very still. 200 yards, he said finally low. That's how far I let you go before I come after you myself, plan or no plan. That's more generous than I expected. Don't get used to it. She went on foot, alone, through the last stretch of open ground toward the west gate, every step feeling longer than the last, every gap of exposed field between her and the wall, an eternity stretched thin across raw nerves. The gate stood open. No guards visible in the gap, no movement at all that she could see. Which could mean it's clear, she thought, forcing her feet to keep moving at a street's unhurried pace despite everything in her screaming to run or to stop entirely. Or it could mean they're simply waiting until you're close enough that running won't matter anymore. She reached the gate. And there, just inside it, pressed back against the cold stone in the kind of stillness only decades of careful survival can teach a person, stood Torin. His face, when he saw her, did something complicated, relief and terror, and something like pride all moving across it at once before he mastered it back into the flat, careful blankness of a man who has spent 40 years learning not to show what he feels in front of walls that might have ears. You came, he said barely above a breath, you opened the gate. Barely. His eyes flicked past her, scanning the open ground behind. 2 of Draven's men were posted here until an hour ago. I sent them chasing a rumor about smoke seen near the old grain stores. It won't hold them long. How long? Long enough if your king moves fast. His eyes came back to her face and something in them, old and tired and fiercely loyal, settled. Tell him the inner guard is split. Half will hold for Draven out of fear. The other half. He paused, and something almost like a smile ghosted across his weathered face. The other half have been waiting days for someone to give them a reason to remember who they actually swore their oath to. Ren turned, raised her arm high above her head, toward the distant fold in the land where 80 riders waited on a decision she was making for them right now. In this single gesture, and in the fold of land behind her, she saw the column begin, at last, to move. The world after that dissolved as it had before, into fragments too fast for her mind to fully process in order. The gate opening wider. Bastion's men flooding through it in disciplined, controlled waves, nothing like the chaos she'd feared, nothing like open battle. The inner yard, the castle's own guard forming up uncertainly, weapons half drawn, watching the approach with the particular terrible suspension of men waiting to discover, in the next several seconds, which side history was about to prove they'd chosen. A beta captain at their head, a man Ren recognized by sight but had never learned the name of, looked at Kale, dismissant now, standing in the inner yard with his ruined armor replaced by something borrowed but unmistakably regal in bearing. The captain to one knee. The men behind him followed like a wave finding the shore, one after another, weapons lowering, the entire terrible tension of the moment collapsing at once into something that sounded, more than anything, like relief given a voice. It's working, Ren thought, standing at the edge of it all, breathless, disbelieving. It's actually working, except Draven, she thought, the spiral catching fire again even as the yard around her erupted into the ordered chaos of a castle rearranging in real time its understanding of who was in charge. Except you never found him. A man like that does not simply wait quietly in a chair to be arrested. They found Draven, eventually, not in his borrowed receiving chamber but in the small private study adjoining it, a room Ren hadn't even known existed until Torin, moving through the castle now with the unhurried authority of a man finally free to act openly, led Kale and Usolda straight to its door. Inside they found Draven seated at a narrow writing desk, the forged succession documents nowhere in sight. You, he said when Kale filled the doorway. His narrow face had gone the particular gray of a man whose entire architecture of belief has collapsed at once, and who hasn't yet processed what he's standing in the rubble of. Me. Kale agreed. The documents, Kale said. Where are they gone? Draven said. Sent ahead this morning, before your riders were ever sighted. A thin, humorless smile. You've reclaimed a castle, my king, but the claim I built is already on its way to hands that will use it whether or not I'm here to explain myself. Whose handsets? Kale said, voice dropping into something dangerously quiet. Draven's smile didn't waver. That would rather spoil the rest of your week, wouldn't it? Ren felt the cold certainty settle over her all at once, the thing she'd been circling since the receiving chamber finally arriving with full unwelcome clarity. This isn't finished, she thought, watching Draven's calm, satisfied face, watching Kale's jaw tighten with a fury she'd never once seen from him, not even chained in a dungeon days ago. This was never going to be finished the moment we walked through that gate. Draven was never the architect of this. Draven was the hand. Someone else built the plan. Someone patient enough and connected enough to source a poison from half a kingdom away. Someone withstanding enough to sign a false succession and make it look real to a council that hasn't yet chosen, which means the real fight hasn't started yet. It's only just been revealed. The castle took several days to stop feeling like a battlefield and start feeling like a home again. Ren spent most of that time in Azelda's old workroom restocking shelves that Draven's people had rifled through looking for anything useful, and finding more than once that her hands were shaking for reasons that had nothing to do with fatigue. Because it isn't finished, she kept telling herself, sorting dried yarrow into jars with fingers that wouldn't quite settle. Because Draven said it himself, standing in that study with his whole plan already collapsing around him. Someone else has the documents, let's now. Someone withstanding enough to make a lie look like the truth. And you still don't know who. She wasn't alone in the wondering. Bastion's men had swept the castle top to bottom in the first hour after the gate fell, and found nothing. No rider Nisbispich that morning. No messenger seen leaving before the column arrived. Nothing except Draven's own calm, satisfied silence, which he maintained through every question Kale put to him personally in the days that followed. You'll get nothing more from him, Isolde said, finding Ren in the workroom long after most of the castle had gone quiet. He's decided silence is the only weapon he has left. Men like that hold on to the last thing they control like it's a crown of its own. Then we're guessing. For now. Isolde leaned against the frame, arms crossed, the scar along her jaw catching the lamplight. Bastion thinks it's Harrow. Consolidating power now that Draven's fallen, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. Do you think that Isolde was quiet a moment? Harrow's a soldier, she said finally. Soldiers plan for battles. What Draven built, the poison, the timing, the forged succession, that's not battlefield thinking. That's years of patience. Harrow doesn't have years of patience in him. He has 300 swords and not much else. Then who does have that kind of patience? Isolde didn't answer. But something in her face, careful and closed, told Ren she had already had a name in mind, and wasn't ready yet to say it out loud. Kale found her an hour after Isolde left, standing over the same shelf of yarrow, still not sorted, her mind clearly somewhere else entirely. You've been in this room for days, he said. I've been avoiding the Great Hall for days, Ren corrected. There's a difference. The Great Hall is full of lords deciding what to think of me. This room is full of dried herbs that don't have opinions. Something that was almost a laugh moved through him, the first she'd heard since the gate fell, low and rough from disuse. They're not deciding what to think of you, he said. They already know what to think. Bastion's told the story 3 times now, and it gets more dramatic each time he tells it. That's not reassuring, it's not meant to be. He crossed the room, picked up a jar of dried yarrow, turned it over once in his hands with the particular care of a man who genuinely didn't know what he was holding but wanted to seem like he did. I came to tell you something. Draven's finally said one useful thing. Ren went still. What? He confirmed the second signature. Cal set the jar down carefully. He wouldn't give a name. But he confirmed there is one, someone who helped him source the dusk scrut. Someone who witnessed and sealed the succession documents to make them stand up to council scrutiny. That's not nothing, it's not much either. He looked at her gray eyes steady in the lamplight. But it confirms what you already suspected in that receiving chamber. This was never Draven's plan alone. He was the piece willing to be seen, someone else built the board. Which means, Ren thought, the cold certainty she'd been carrying for days finally finding words. Which means the true danger in this castle right now isn't the man we already caught. It's the one still walking around free, still trusted, still sitting at whatever table decides what happens next. We need to find them, she said, before they finish whatever Draven started. I know. Kale's jaw tightened. The problem is we don't know where to look. And every day we spend guessing is a day they spend covering their tracks. The answer, when it finally came, arrived from a direction none of them expected. Isolde arrived at the castle on the 4th morning after the gate fell, summoned by messenger the moment word had reached her, traveling faster than a woman her age should have reasonably managed. And the reunion between teacher and apprentice happened in the workroom doorway, with considerably more force than either of them had planned. You reckless, impossible girl, Isolde said, holding Ren at arm's length, eyes bright and furious and wet all at once. 6 years I trained you not to be seen. 6 years. And in 1 week you've become the single most talked about person in this entire kingdoms. I know. Do you have any idea what could have happened? I know, Isolde. You don't. You genuinely don't. Because if you understood even half of what could have gone wrong, you'd never have done any of it. And I find myself deeply unable to decide whether that makes me proud of you or furious enough to lock you in this workroom until you're 40. Bothan said, you're allowed both. Isolde made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and pulled her into an embrace that lasted considerably longer than either of them would admit to later. But it was 2 hours after that reunion, once Isolde had settled and eaten, and finally stopped fussing over whether Ren had been sleeping enough, that the conversation turned towards something far more useful than relief. The compound they used, Isolde said, studying the notes Maeve had sent ahead with Bastion's writer's details of Kale's condition. The treatment already given, the confirmed presence of duskroot in his system. This is worse than I think anyone's told you. Ren felt her stomach drop. Worse how duskroot suppresses the bond, Isolde said. That much you already know. But it does more than suppress it temporarily. Left untreated past a certain window, the suppression becomes permanent. The bond doesn't recover on its own, it simply stops, like a muscle left unused so long it forgets entirely how to move. The room went very quiet. How long is the window, Ren asked. Though some cold certain part of her already suspected, she wasn't going to like the answer. Isolde checked her notes again, cross-referencing dates, dosage estimates. The timeline of exposure Maeve had painstakingly reconstructed from the state of Cole's wounds. 14 days, she said finally, from first exposure. After that, whatever remains suppressed forever. Ren did the arithmetic before Isolde had even finished speaking, the dates lining up in her mind with the particular sickening clarity of a countdown she hadn't known she was already running. 9 days had passed since the dungeon, 5 remained. And no one in this castle, she thought. The panicky fast and cold before she could stop it, no one. Not Maeve, not Iselda, not any healer in this entire kingdom has ever needed to cure this before. Because Tchroot is so rare that no one has ever survived long enough exposed to it to need a cure at all. Which means there might not be one. Which means you have 5 days to find something that may not exist. She didn't tell Cale immediately. Not because she wanted to hide it from him, she'd promised herself in Ashmere she wouldn't soften things for him. And she meant keep that promise, but because she needed first to understand exactly what she was telling him before she put it into words he couldn't take back. She found him in the map room that evening, alone, studying the same charcoal reconstruction he'd drawn in Maeve's cottage, now transferred properly to vellum and marked up with the positions of Bastion's men, the state of the eastern garrison, everything a king needed to track in the chaotic days after reclaiming a throne. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. Something in her voice made him look up immediately, all the careful political calculation draining out of his face at once. Ren, please, let me finish. He set down the charcoal. Waited. She told him everything. The window, the 14 days. The 5 that remained. The fact that no healer in living memory had ever needed to treat this because no one had ever survived exposure long enough to need it. When she finished, the silence in the room stretched long enough that she started, despite everything, to worry she'd broken something in him that wouldn't easily mend. 5 days, he said finally, very quietly. 5 days. And if nothing is found in that time, then whatever's already suppressed stays that way. She made herself say it plainly, the way she'd promised him she would. Permanently. He was quiet a long moment, looking at the map spread beneath his hands, at a kingdom he'd just reclaimed with a body that might already be starting, silently and irreversibly, to become something less than it had been. I spent 5 days chained to a wall, he said finally, believing the worst thing that could happen to me was dying in that cell. A humorless breath, almost a laugh. I didn't consider that surviving it might simply mean losing the thing that made me what I am, one day at a time, without ever knowing exactly when the last piece slipped away. You're not losing anything yet, Ren said. You have 5 days, I aim to use every hour of them. He looked up at her. You're certain there's something to find? No, she said honestly, I'm not certain of anything. But I've spent my whole life being told there's nothing an Omega can offer that anyone with real power actually Something hardened in her voice, quiet and absolute. I don't intend to let that be true about this too. She spent the first of the 5 days going through every text in Iselda's collection, every scrap of knowledge on rare poisons, bonded suppression, wolf nature medicine, that either of them had ever gathered in decades of careful patient study. Nothing. Duskroot appeared exactly twice in the entire collection, once as a footnote in a 100-year-old treatise on suppressants, describing only its existence and rarity, and once in Iselda's own notes from years ago, a single line that simply read source unknown, effects theorized, never confirmed. We're guessing, Ren said, on the evening of the first day, staring at that single unhelpful line until the words stopped meaning anything at all. We're guessing at a cure for something almost no one has ever studied. Then we guess carefully, Iselda said, and we guess fast. They sent word to Maeve, still in Ashmere, asking whether her years as a field healer during the border conflicts had ever brought her into contact with anything resembling this. The answer, when it came back by rider on the morning of the second day, was 3 careful, devastating words. Nothing like. By the end of the second day, Ren had stopped sleeping in any meaningful sense, catching an hour here, 20 minutes there, always jolting awake with the same cold certainty pressing against her chest. 3 days left. 3 days, and you have nothing except old footnotes and a healer 3 days right away who's never seen anything like it either. Which means the answer isn't in anyone else's knowledge. Which means, if it exists at all, it's somewhere you haven't looked yet. It was Torin, of all people, who gave her the thread that finally led somewhere. He found her on the morning of the third day, exhaustion carved into every line of her face, still hunched over Iselda's oldest texts by candlelight, though the sun had been up for an hour. You look like a woman who hasn't slept since the gate fell, he said, setting down a plate of bread and cheese she hadn't asked for and clearly wasn't going to be permitted to refuse. I haven't. Won't do him any good if you collapse before you find whatever you're looking for. I know that too. She rubbed her eyes, forced herself to focus on his weathered face instead of the blur of text in front of her. Torin. 40 years in this castle. Have you ever heard anyone speak of Duskroot before this week? Anyone at all? He was quiet a long moment, chewing on the question the way old men chew on things they haven't thought about in decades. Once, he said finally. Long time ago. Before your time, girl. Before even the old king's time, near enough. Ren's whole body went still. There was a healer here once, before Iselda. Before Zelda's teacher even. A woman who kept to herself. Mostly. Studied things the guild healers considered too dangerous to bother with. He frowned, dredging the memory up from somewhere very far back. I remember my own mother speaking of her when I was young enough to still be underfoot in the kitchens. Said she'd written everything down. Every remedy, every poison, every cure she'd ever puzzled out. In a book she kept locked away because half of what she studied could kill a person as easily as heal them. He paused, frowning harder, as though pulling the next detail up from somewhere even further back. My mother said something else too. Said the woman never wrote plain. Wrote in some strange private shorthand of her own devising, half symbols, half old letters twisted about, so that no fool who found the book by accident could ever make sense of what was inside it. Only someone who already knew the old way of writing could ever hope to puzzle it out at all. Something in Ren went very still and very warm, all at once, in a way that had nothing to do with the candle flame beside her, because she knew that kind of writing. 'Cause when she was 15, newly arrived at this castle and desperate to be worth the trouble of feeding, she had taught herself to read from Iselda's oldest and strangest texts, the crabbed, abbreviated notations of healers 3 generations gone, matching symbol to meaning alone, by candlelight, night after night, because no one else had thought it worth the effort of teaching an Omega girl anything at all. She had built that skill herself, out of stubbornness and loneliness and nothing else, had never once in 8 years found a use for it that mattered beyond her own workroom. Which meant, if this book existed, if anyone in this entire castle might actually be able to read it, it might be her. And no one else of the book.
No idea,
Torin admitted. The woman died. No family to things. I'd assume the castle simply absorbed it, the way castles do. Into some cellar. Some forgotten shelf, somewhere no one's thought to look in 50 which means, Ren thought, hope flaring dangerous and fragile in her chest, which means there might be an answer in this castle after all. Just not anywhere anyone's bothered searching in half a century. Where would something like that end up, she asked. If no one claimed it, if no one thought it mattered enough to catalog properly, Torin considered. The old records cellar, he said slowly, beneath the West Tower. Nobody's been down there in years. It's where things go when nobody knows what else to do with them. The records cellar beneath the West Tower had not seen a lit torch in what looked, from the thickness of dust alone, like a very long time indeed. Ren descended the narrow stairs with Torin's borrowed lantern held high, coughing against air that tasted of old paper and older neglect, and found herself in a low chamber crammed floor to ceiling with the accumulated, forgotten detritus of a castle that had simply never bothered clearing out its own history. This could take days, she thought, staring at the shelves stretching back further than the lantern light could reach. Days you'd have. 3 days left, and a room full of a century of forgotten paper, and no idea at all which shelf might hold the one book that matters. Except stop. Except think, the way Iselda taught you to think. A healer who studied dangerous things, who kept her notes locked away. She wouldn't have shelved her own work among ordinary household ledgers. She'd have kept it somewhere separate. Somewhere marked, even quietly, as different from everything around it. She moved through the cellar methodically, scanning not for titles but for anything set apart, a shelf slightly cleaner than its neighbors, where someone once dusted regularly, a gap where something had clearly been removed and returned many times, the particular wear pattern of a book handled often by careful urgent hands. She found it in the cellar's furthest corner, nearly 2 hours in, lantern oil burning dangerously low. A small iron-bound chest, tucked behind a stack of ordinary tax ledgers, as though someone, at some point, had deliberately hidden it in plain sight among things no one would ever bother examining closely. Her hands shook as she worked the ancient latch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, lay a single book. Hand-bound. The cover soft from decades of handling before whoever last held it had, for reasons lost to time, finally set it down and never picked it up again. She opened it, and her heart sank for one long moment, because the script inside was nothing like ordinary writing at all. Cramped symbols, half letters, marks that meant nothing at first glance to an untrained eye. Except they weren't entirely unfamiliar. Except the shapes echoed, distantly, the same old abbreviated hand she'd spent years teaching herself to read from, Iselda's own oldest notes, back when she was 15, and desperate and certain that knowledge was the one thing in the world nobody could take from her simply because of what she was. She sat on the cellar floor with the lantern burning low and worked through it letter by letter, symbol by symbol, the way she had taught herself everything else in her life. Slowly. Stubbornly. Alone. Page after page of cramped, careful script finally yielding to her the way a stubborn lock yields to a patient hand. Remedies, poisons, cross-references between them, the kind only a truly obsessive mind bothers cataloging. This poison countered by that root, this suppression reversed by that combination, painstakingly documented by a woman who'd clearly spent her entire life fascinated by the exact line between medicine and harm. And there, nearly 2/3 of the way through, in handwriting slightly more hurried than the entries around it, as though the author herself had been racing against some deadline of her own duskroot suppression. Reversal theorized, never tested on living subject. Compound of moonflower root, crushed silverbark and blood of the afflicted, taken at the rise of the full moon, within the window before the bond fully severs. Rerin stared at the page until the words blurred, until she had to blink hard, twice, to make sure she wasn't simply seeing what desperation wanted her to see. It was real. Written in careful, deliberate hand, cross-referenced against 3 other entries in the same scribing fetch individual components, properties in exhaustive methodical detail. Theorized, never tested on a living subject. Which means this could work. Or it could kill him outright, and you'd never know which until it was already too late to try anything else. She closed the book, held it against her chest, and climbed the narrow stairs back up into daylight with a single, terrible truth settling into her chest alongside the fragile hope. She had less than 3 days left to decide, and no way at all to be certain of the choice before she made it. She brought the book straight to Iselda, who read the entry 3 times in total silence before finally looking up, her face carved into an expression Wren had rarely seen on her in 6 years of apprenticeship: fear. Genuine, unguarded fear. Moonflower root and silverbark, Iselda said slowly. Both grow locally. We have both or close enough that I could gather what's needed by evening. She paused. It's the third component that concerns me. His blood. Not simply his blood. His blood, combined with 2 substances that in the wrong proportion, are each independently capable of stopping a healthy heart. This isn't a remedy, Wren. This is a gamble dressed up in careful handwriting by a woman who never once tested it on anyone before she died and left it in a box no one opened for 50 years. I know what it is, do you? Iselda's voice sharpened, the fear underneath it finally breaking through. Because if you administer this and it's wrong, if the proportions are off, if the moon phase matters in some way this book doesn't fully explain, if there's detail this healer knew in her own head and simply never bothered writing down because she assumed she'd be the one performing it herself, you won't simply fail to cure him. You'll kill him, tonight. With your own hands. The words landed like a physical blow. Wren sat with them a long moment, the weight of the book still resting against her chest, the fragile hope from the cellar curdling into something far heavier. She's right, Wren thought, and the spiral began before she could stop it. She's completely right, and you know it. And you have less than 3 days left to decide, and there is no version of tonight where you get to be certain before you act. There is only the version where you try, and hope, and risk everything on the handwriting of a dead woman who never lived to see whether her own theory actually worked. Except the alternative is doing nothing, except the alternative is watching him lose something that can never come back, permanently, forever, because you were too frightened of being wrong to try being right. Which is worse. Which is genuinely, truly worse, and you already know the answer. You've known it since you read that entry in the cellar. You're just afraid to say it out loud because saying it makes it real. I have to tell him, she said finally. It has to be his choice, not mine. Iselda held her gaze a long moment, then nodded slowly, some of the fear in her face settling into something closer to grim acceptance. Then go, she said quickly. The moon rises tonight, and if this window closes before you've decided anything at all, the decision will have been made for you regardless. She found Cale in the map room again, and told him everything: the book, the entry, the terrible uncertainty sitting at the heart of it, Iselda's warning about proportions and moon phases, and a woman's identity there might save him or might simply quietly kill him tonight instead. He listened without interrupting, the way he'd learned to listen to her over the past days, and when she finished, he was quiet for what felt like a very long time. You're telling me, he said finally, that the only cure that exists was written by a woman who never lived to test it, that it might work, or it might stop my heart before midnight. Yes. And you're the one who would have to administer it. Yes, he looked at her, gray eyes steady despite everything, despite the weight of what she'd just laid at his feet. What would you do, he asked, if you were the one deciding for yourself, not for a king, not for a kingdom that needs him whole, just for yourself? Exact choice. Wren didn't answer immediately. She let the question sit, turned it over honestly, Refused to give him a comforting lie simply because it was easier than the truth. "I'd try it," she said finally. "Because living the rest of my life having lost something that mattered, without ever once trying to get it back, would be worse to me than the risk of losing everything tonight instead." Something moved across his face, not quite relief, not quite fear, something heavier and more complicated than either. "That's my answer too," he said. "Do it. Kale, I trusted you in a dungeon with nothing but a clay pot and a story about a cousin who doesn't exist," he said, quiet and absolute. "I trust you with this." They performed it that night under a full moon that seemed, to Ren's exhausted, terrified eyes, unbearably bright against the dark castle walls. Iselda measured the moonflower root and silver bark, with hands that hadn't shaken like that in years, and Ren drew the blood herself, because she refused to let anyone else's hands be the last thing Kale felt if this went wrong. The mixture, when finally combined, turned a deep, unsettling silver blue, catching the moonlight in a way that felt, despite everything Ren's rational mind insisted, faintly alive. Kale took the cup from her hands without hesitation. "If this doesn't work," he said, looking at her over the rim of it, "I want you to know that none of the last days would have gone differently, even if I'd known this was where it would end. Don't talk like that's a possibility. It is a possibility. Establish that clearly enough." A faint, exhausted almost smile. "I'd simply either say it now while I still can, then leave it unsaid and let you wonder later whether I meant it." Ren felt something break loose in her chest, something she'd been holding too tightly for days to properly examine. "Drink it," she said, voice rough. "And then you can say whatever you like to me tomorrow, when you're still here to say it." He held her eyes a moment longer, then he drank. The next several minutes stretched into something that felt to Ren like the longest span of time she had ever lived through. Kale's breathing changed, first sharper, then slower, then sharper again, his whole body going rigid against the chair Iselda had insisted he sit in case whatever happened next required him to be caught rather than simply observed. His pulse, Iselda said, fingers pressed to his wrist, voice tight with the calm that Ren recognized. From the specific calm a healer adopts precisely when the situation has stopped being calm at all. Racing, too fast. Is that the poison working, or the cure killing him? "I don't know," Iselda admitted, and the honesty was somehow worse than any lie could have been. "I genuinely don't know, Ren. We're past anything I've ever seen or trained for." Kale's eyes had closed. His jaw was locked tight, every muscle in his body straining against something none of them could see, and Ren found herself gripping his hand without remembering the decision to do it, holding on as though her own grip alone could anchor him to the room, to the moment, to being alive. Because if this is wrong, she thought, the spiral tearing through her faster than she could contain it. Because if you've killed him, if a dead woman's untested theory and your own desperate hope have just ended a king's life on a night that should have been the beginning of everything getting better instead of worse, stop. Except panic won't help him now any more than it would have helped in that dungeon, so breathe, so watch. So do the only thing left to do, which is wait, and hold on, and trust the choice you already made. Kale's back arched once sharply, a sound tearing loose from his throat was half agony and half something else entirely, something that sounded impossibly almost like relief. And then all at once he went still. For one terrible endless second Ren was certain, absolutely certain, that stillness meant the worst thing it could possibly mean. Then his chest rose, slow, steady. Nothing labored about it at all. Nothing like the careful, costly breathing she'd grown used to over days of watching Frisian, his own strength like a man, counting coins he couldn't afford to spend. His eyes opened. And when they found hers, gray and clear and unmistakably, entirely present, something in them had changed. Something that had been dimmed, muted, quietly suppressed since the moment iron chains first bit into his skin, was simply back. "Present whole," he said, and his voice, for the first time since the dungeon, held no strain in it at all. She didn't trust herself to speak. She simply held his hand tighter, and let the tears she'd been refusing to allow herself for days finally silently fall. Iselda confirmed it an hour later, once the castle's own healers had been brought in to verify what she already knew from experience alone, the bond fully restored. Whatever the Duskroot had suppressed, the theorized cure, tested for the very first time on a living subject who happened to be a king, had reversed entirely. "That woman," Iselda said quietly, still holding the ancient book in her hands, staring at it with an expression somewhere between reverence and disbelief, "died 50 years ago without ever knowing whether her life's work actually meant anything at all." "It meant everything," Ren said. "Yes," Iselda looked up at her, "and you're the one who found it. In a cellar no one else thought to search, in a book no one else in this castle could even have read." Because you taught yourself alone, years ago, exactly the kind of old hand it was written in. You were the only person in this entire kingdom who could have opened that book and made any sense of it at all. She didn't say anything else, she didn't need to. Ren and Uster stood standing there in the aftermath of the longest night of her life. Exactly what her teacher was telling her, even unspoken. You did this, Iselda's silence said. Not luck, not chance, you. But the castle Ren returned to over the following days was not. She quickly discovered a castle that had simply solved its problems and settled peacefully back into order. Draven's silence held through every attempt to break it, and Bastien's council, gathering in fuller numbers each this day as word spread that the king had truly survived and truly reclaimed his throne, grew increasingly restless with a mystery that refused to resolve. It was Lord Harrow of all people who finally broke first. He arrived at Ravengard some days later, not with 300 swords as everyone had feared, but alone, under a flag that begged more than it demanded, requesting an audience with a king he had, by every measure of law, actively conspired against. Chaol received him in the great hall, Ren standing at the edge of the assembled council alongside Bastien, Isel and a growing number of lords who had, in recent days, decided rather abruptly that loyalty to the crown was after all the wiser long-term investment. Harrow knelt the moment he entered. My king, he said, and his voice, unlike Draven's calm, satisfied confidence, carried the particular strain of a man who has finally understood, too late, exactly how badly he miscalculated. I come to confess and to beg whatever mercy at fit to offer. Confess to what? Chaol said, voice flat and cold in a way Ren hadn't heard from him before. To lending my garrison to Draven's ambitions, Harrow said. To believing his promises of shared power once the succession was settled. To being in every way that matters a willing participant in what was done to you. He paused, and something in his bowed shoulders shifted, genuine fear finally surfacing. But I did not know of the duskroot until after it was already used. I swear that on whatever remains of my honor, Draven never told me the full shape of his plan. He kept that piece for himself and for one other. The room went utterly silent. Harrow's throat worked once visibly, before he finally spoke. Lady Corrin, he said. She provided the duskroot. She provided the physician's knowledge to use it correctly, enough to weaken you without killing you outright, because a dead king invites war. But a king who simply fails to recover invites something far more useful. Regency. Guardianship. Control, exercised quietly, through whatever puppet the council eventually accepts in your place. The name landed in the great hall like a physical blow, and Ren felt every certainty she'd built over the past days rearrange itself at once around a single devastating realization. Lady Corrin. The Lord Bastien himself had described, in the earliest days of this whole desperate plan, as neutral reasonable. A lady with no love for Draven, no obvious stake in his ambitions, someone the council trusted. Precisely, she'd never seemed to want anything for herself at all. Which was exactly the point, Ren thought. The pieces sliding into place with sickening clarity. Which was always exactly the point. A woman patient enough to want nothing visibly for years, while quietly arranging everything from just outside the frame anyone was watching. She has a daughter. Ren remembered suddenly, the details surfacing from some half-forgotten conversation in Bastien's council room. A daughter of marriageable age with a claim through an old bloodline connection to the crown, distant but not impossible to argue in the right circumstances. If Chaol had simply failed to recover, if he'd survived, weakened, unable to fully rule, needing a regency, needing a guardian, she wouldn't have needed a war at all. She would have simply needed patience, and a council desperate enough for stability to accept whatever arrangement she proposed. Chaol's expression when Ren looked at him had gone very still, in exactly the way it had gone still in the gully, watching 40 riders pass 200 yards away. Not the stillness of shock. The stillness of a man rapidly, coldly, recalculating everything he thought he understood. Where is Lady Corrin now? He said. Traveling, Harrow said. She left the region days ago, officially to visit her daughter's household in the eastern. Officially. His eyes flicked briefly toward the great hall's doors, as if some part of him still expected soldiers loyal to her to come pouring through them at any moment. I don't know if that's the truth. It was not, as it turned out, the truth at all. Isolde's riders confirmed within a day that Lady Corrin had never reached the eastern provinces. Her party had turned north instead, toward the border, toward territory that belonged to neither crown nor council but to a scattered collection of minor holdings that had for generations existed in the deliberately vague space between one kingdom's authority and the next. She's running, Bastien said, studying the map with the grim focus of a man who had only days ago believed this entire crisis nearly resolved. Which means she knows Harrow's confession is coming or has already come. Which means she's had time to prepare an escape long before any of us suspected her at all. How much time? Kale asked. Enough, Isolde said. That catching her on the open road is no longer realistic. If she reaches the border holdings before we do, she'll have allies there. Old debts owed to her family for generations. Ground she knows better than any of us. The room fell into particular tense of people confronting a problem that speed alone could no longer solve. Then we don't catch her on the road, Ren said. Every head turned toward her. We let her think she succeeded, Ren continued, the shape of it forming even as she spoke, the way it always seemed to when the stakes were highest and there was no time left to second-guess herself. We let her reach the border. We let her believe she's safe, and then we bring the truth to the one place she can't outrun it. Which is where? Bastien asked. The full council, Ren said. Every lord who might have been asked eventually to accept her regency plan. If she's exposed publicly, completely, undeniably, in front of every witness whose support she'd have needed, then it doesn't matter whether she's standing in this hall or hiding at the edge of the world. Her plan dies either way because the only thing that ever made it work was secrecy. Kale studied her a long moment. You want to try her in absence, he said slowly. I want to make her guilt so thoroughly publicly certain, Ren said, that hiding stops being a victory at all. A woman who spent years building patient, quiet influence has nothing left once that influence is destroyed in front of everyone who ever trusted it. Something shifted in Bastien's expression, old, careful respect, deepening into something closer to genuine surprise. You've thought about this a great deal, he said. For someone who spent the last stretch of days saving a king's life instead of plotting a lord's downfall. I've thought about very little else, Ren admitted, since the moment I understood what Draven's silence was actually protecting. The full council convened several days later. Every lord of standing in the kingdom summoned to Ravengard's great hall under circumstances none of them had ever experienced before, a formal tribunal, conducted not against a prisoner in chains but against an empty chair, reserved pointedly at the center of the room for a woman who had not answered the summons and by every account Isolde's riders could confirm, had no intention of ever doing so. Ren stood at the edge of the hall as the proceedings opened, watching lords she'd never met before this week settle into receipts with expressions ranging from genuine confusion to poorly hidden alarm, the particular alarm of people beginning to suspect correctly that whatever was about to be revealed might implicate choices they themselves had made in recent months, without ever fully understanding the game they'd been playing. Harrow testified first, his confession from days earlier repeated now for the full council's record, stripped of nothing, softened for no one. Bastien followed, laying out the timeline as he understood it: the dungeon, the escape, the Duskroot, the forged succession, the second signature Draven had refused until his own trial days prior to ever fully name. And then Kale called Ren forward. She had not expected this. She saw it in his eyes before he said her name, a small private acknowledgement passing between them, the same quality of attention she'd first noticed in Maeve's cottage, over a charcoal map neither of them had known, then, would eventually lead them here. Tell them what you found, he said, in the cellar, beneath the West Tower. Ren stepped forward into the center of the hall, into a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat, and told them everything. The dungeon. The dying torch. The chains and the compound worked into the iron that Maeve had confirmed as Duskroot. The 14-day window Iselda had discovered, the countdown that had run silently beneath every other crisis of the past days without any of them fully understanding its urgency, until it was nearly too late. The cellar, the forgotten book written in a hand almost no one alive could read, and the untested theory of a dead healer that had, against every reasonable expectation, actually worked. And finally, the arithmetic that connected all of it together, the patience required to source something as rare as Duskroot, the medical knowledge required to weaken a king without killing him outright, the standing required to forge a succession document that could survive a council's scrutiny. One woman in this kingdom has all three of those things, Ren said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. Not brute force. Not battlefield cunning. Patience. And a reputation for neutrality so carefully maintained that none of us thought to question it until a king nearly lost permanently. The very thing that made him who he is. She sufficed hold a moment before finishing. Lord Draven built the swords. But Lady Corrin built Reen to exist at all. A weakened king. A necessary regency. A daughter position, quietly, patiently for years, to be exactly what the council would need once that regency required a face. The hall erupted into the low, urgent murmur of lords realizing, in real time, exactly how close they had come to accepting a plan none of them would ever have recognized as anything other than reasonable, prudent stability right up until the moment its true architect stood revealed. The council's verdict, delivered that same evening after hours of testimony and increasingly heated debate, stripped Lady Corin of every title, every holding, every claim her family had ever pressed toward the crown, a sentence delivered in absence, but no less absolute for the empty chair it addressed. Word would later reach Ravengard weeks after the tribunal closed, that she had indeed reached the border holdings, and found there exactly what Wren had predicted. Doors that had once opened readily for her now closed quietly one by one as the news of her exposure outpaced her own arrival. A woman whose only real power had ever been the careful, patient illusion of trustworthiness discovered too late. That illusions do not survive contact with a council hall full of witnesses. She was never seen in the kingdom again. Draven, tried separately and more thoroughly a week later, was sentenced to permanent exile in the cold northern territories his own ambition had once hoped to rule from a very different chair. Harrow, whose confession had ultimately proven instrumental in unraveling the whole conspiracy, surrendered his garrison and his title both, the eastern lands redistributed among lords who understood, better than he ever had, the difference between loyalty and simple convenience. And Ring, standing at the back of a great hall that had one short stretch of days ago been the site of the most dangerous conversation of her life, found herself watching the machinery of an entire kingdom rearrange itself around the truth she had helped bring to light, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something that was not quite relief and not quite triumph, but sat comfortably enough between the two that she allowed herself, finally, to simply breathe. Cale found her 3 days later in Iselda's workroom, exactly where he'd found her once before, sorting the same jars of dried yarrow that had never quite made it back into proper order through the whole tumultuous stretch of weeks. "You've been avoiding me," he said. "I've been sorting herbs." "You've been avoiding me in a workroom full of herbs," corrected, and something in his tone made her finally set down the jar she was holding and turn to face him fully. He looked different than he had in the dungeon. Different than he had on the frozen mountainside. Different than he had drinking a silver blue potion under a full moon, with no certainty at all that he'd survive to see morning. The careful, costly control that had defined every movement he made since the moment she first found him chained to a wall had eased, finally, into something that looked, for the first time, simply like a man standing in a room, whole and unguarded. "I need to give you," he said. He set a small folded document on the table, sealed with dark wax pressed with the wolf crest of the crown. Wren looked at it, then at him. "What is this?" "A formal appointment," Cale said. "Head of the Healing Guild here at Ravengard. Your own workroom. Your own authority over the castle's medical care, independent of the usual rank hierarchy, answerable to the crown directly and to no one else." Wren stared at the sealed document for a long moment, something complicated and warm and slightly overwhelming moving through her chest. "This isn't a reward," Cale said, voice careful in the particular way she now recognized as the tone he used when something mattered deeply to him. "It's a recognition of what you already are. There's a difference." "There will be people who object," she says quietly. "An Omega holding independent authority." "Yes," Cale agreed. "There will be people who object." Something steady and certain settled into his expression. "I find I am entirely unconcerned with them." The quiet that followed was different from every silence that had come before it, not the silence of a dungeon. Not the tense hush of a strategy room. Not the careful stillness of two people afraid to name what sat between them. This was two people standing in an ordinary room, made extraordinary by everything that had accumulated between them over one impossible stretch of days, both of them fully aware finally that neither intended to step back from it. "I would like you to stay," Cale said finally. "Not as a fugitive on a cold road. Not in a dungeon cell in the dark. Here at Ravengard, where you can do the goals I meant to do." Wren thought about the dungeon, the cold, the chains, the question he'd asked her in the dark why and the answer she'd given him, and how completely, even then, without fully understanding what it would cost her, she had meant it. She thought about Maeve's cottage, and a charcoal map, and days on a frozen road with a man who chose the smoother path without ever once explaining why. She thought about the great hall, where she'd once stood invisible at the very edge of everything, watching a world that had never once made room for her. And how it had never occurred to her, standing there, that the world could actually be changed rather than simply endured. She picked up the sealed document. "I'll need proper herb stores," she said. "The current cellar's a disaster. Half the dried stock is well past useful." Something shifted across Cale's face, slow, genuine, entirely unguarded. The particular expressions when relief and something warmer than relief finally meet in the same moment. "I'll have the cellar master answer to you directly," he said. "Good." He reached across the table. Not for the document, his hand settled over hers, warm and certain, saying without any words at all what both of them understood would take time to say, properly, fully out loud. Time that they now, against every reasonable expectation of the weeks just past, actually had. He straightened eventually and turned toward the door, and stopped in the doorway the way he had once stopped in a dungeon corridor, looking back at her with something he hadn't yet finished saying. "Ren, yes. Thank you," he said, "for not leaving me in the dark." She looked down at the sealed document in her hands, at the wolf pressed into dark wax, at the ordinary extraordinary weight of a thing that bore her name and a recognition she had never once expected in her whole quiet, careful life to actually hold. "You would have found your own way out eventually," she said. "Perhaps." A small honest smile. "But not that night, and not to the same place I've ended up now." He left. Ren stood alone in the warm workroom that smelled of yarrow and rosemary and old wood smoke, holding a document that meant, for the first time in 23 years, that she was no longer invisible unless she chose to be. She listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor, up into a castle that felt improbably, irrevocably, like it finally had space in it for exactly who she was. Iselda appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, took one look at Ren's face, and said nothing at all, simply moved to her side of the worktable and resumed sorting the herbs. Ren had long since abandoned, her ink-stained hands moving with the brisk, unbothered efficiency of decades of practice. After a while, without looking up, she said, "The yarrow goes on the left shelf." "It always has, I know," Ren said, and went back to work. The kingdom's records would later note, in the careful script of whatever clerk was eventually assigned such things, that in the year the wolf returned from the deep, a formal appointment was made unprecedented in the realm's long history, granting an Omega woman independent authority within the royal castle's own walls. Those same records noted that the appointment came directly from the king himself, and that in all the years that followed, it was never once challenged. Not by anyone who valued their standing in that court, and eventually not by anyone at all, because the woman who held it proved, year after year, precisely why it had been earned. Torin retired from the gate the following spring, at Kael's quiet insistence, given a small cottage within the castle walls and a stipend that asked nothing of him except that he finally rest. He spent his remaining years tending a garden in the inner ward and greeted Ren every morning on her way to the workroom with the particular, satisfied nod of a man who knows exactly what he knows, and sees no need at all to explain it further. Iselda lived many more years after that, sharp-minded to the very end, and never once admitted to having orchestrated any part of what happened. Those who knew her best considered this the single most transparent lie she ever told. And Ren, who had once descended into a dark, forgotten place on the coldest night of her life, carrying nothing but a clay pot salve, and the simple, stubborn belief that no one should be left to disappear quietly, remained at Ravengard for the rest of her days. Not invisible. Not at the edges of anything ever again. At the very center of it all, exactly where, it turned out, she had always belonged. Years later, when Ravengard's healing guild had grown from a single cluttered workroom into 3, and a handful of young apprentices had come and gone through Ren's careful, exacting instruction, a girl no older than 15 found her way to the workroom door one gray autumn morning, hands trembling around a satchel of borrowed books. She had heard the story, of course. Every child in the kingdom had heard some version of it by then, embellished and re-embellished with every telling, until the true shape of that first cold night was nearly impossible to find beneath all the layers people had piled on top of it for the sake of a better tale. "They say you taught yourself to read," the girl said, standing very straight, the way people stand when they've rehearsed a question a dozen times and are still afraid of asking it wrong, from old books before anyone thought it worth teaching you properly. "I did," Ren said. "Why?" Ren looked at her a long moment. At the stubborn set of the girl's jaw, the same stubbornness she recognized, distantly, in her own reflection from a lifetime ago. From a girl who had once decided that knowledge was the one thing no one could take from her simply because of what she was. "Because someone told me once that no one expects much from a girl like us," Ren said, "and I decided I would rather be ready for the day that assumption turned out to be wrong than spend my whole life proving it right." She reached for the nearest shelf, pulled down the oldest and strangest of her own collected texts, and set it on the table between them. "Sit down," she said. "We'll start with the old hand first. Everything else follows from that." Outside, the autumn wind moved through the inner ward exactly the way it always had, and somewhere beyond the workroom window, A king who had once been chained in the dark walked the battlements of a castle he had nearly lost twice over. Face now whole now, because a healer's apprentice had once decided that a locked door mattered less than an open one, and that no one, king or otherwise, should ever be left to disappear quietly into it.